Welcome to Saga Dream Tales, the place where you can relax, unwind, and drift into calm stories shaped by ancient world. Here, every tale moves slowly, carried by soft words and peaceful rhythm, made to ease your mind and guide you into a quiet space. In today's journey, we travel to the realm of the first beings, to the land of ice and stone where giants have dwelled since the very beginning of time. We walk through Jotunheim, where mountains touch the sky and ancient magic flows through frozen rivers and eternal glaciers. This path is gentle, timeless, and filled with the quiet wisdom of the old northern land. All you need to do now is sit back, breathe deeply, and let the story unfold at its own slow pace. Close your eyes if you wish. Let your body settle into comfort, and allow yourself to be carried away to a time before time, when the first giant emerged from ice and fire, and the world was born from the meeting of opposites. The journey begins now. In the time before time, when the world was not yet a world, there was only emptiness. This emptiness had a name. It was called Ginnungagap, the yawning void. It stretched in all directions, endless and dark and silent. There were no stars in this emptiness. There was no moon. There was no sun to warm anything, for there was nothing yet to warm. But on one side of this great emptiness, something existed. It was a realm of ice and frost and bitter cold. This place was called Niflheim, the world of mist. From the heart of Niflheim flowed rivers of freezing water. These rivers had special names, ancient names that few remember. They flowed out from a great well called Ymir, the roaring cauldron. The waters were cold beyond imagining. They carried with them a poison, a venom that would freeze anything it touched. On the other side of the emptiness was another realm. This place was the opposite of Niflheim in every way. It was called Muspelheim, the land of fire. Here there was no ice, no frost, no cold. Instead, flames danced and leaped. Heat radiated from every surface. Sparks flew through the air like tiny stars. The fire here was older than old, burning since the first moment anything had ever burned. For countless ages, these two realms stayed separate. The ice remained in its place. The fire remained in its place. The emptiness between them remained empty and dark. But slowly, over time so long it cannot be measured, things began to change. The rivers from Niflheim continued to flow. They moved through the darkness, through the void. As they traveled farther from their source, the poison within them began to freeze. Layer after layer of ice formed. These layers built up, one upon another, filling the northern part of the great emptiness. The ice was black in some places, gray in others, white where it was newest. It groaned and cracked as it formed, making sounds like thunder in the silence. From Muspelheim, the heat continued to pour forth. It radiated across the southern part of the emptiness. The air there grew warm, then hot, then burning. Sparks and embers drifted on currents of heat. They glowed red and orange and yellow in the darkness. And then, in the very center of Ginnungagap, the ice and the fire met. Where the freezing cold touched the burning heat, something remarkable happened. The ice began to melt. Water dripped and flowed. Steam rose up in great clouds. The poison in the ice mixed with the water and the heat. And from this mixture, from this meeting of opposites, life began. The first drops of melted ice fell into the void. They gathered together, forming larger drops. These drops joined with others, growing bigger and bigger. The heat from Muspelheim warmed them. The cold from Niflheim shaped them. And slowly, very slowly, these drops took form. The form they took was enormous. It was larger than mountains that did not yet exist. It had the shape of a being, of something alive. This being had arms and legs. It had a torso and a head. It had eyes that opened for the first time and looked upon the emptiness. It had a mouth that drew its first breath. It had a heart that began to beat, slow and steady and strong. This was Ymir, the first giant. He was the ancestor of all giants that would ever be. He was ancient, before anything else was born. His body was made of ice and meltwater, of poison and fire. Of everything that existed in those earliest moments, Ymir lay in the space between ice and fire. He was neither fully awake nor fully asleep. He existed in a state between states, ancient and new at the same time. His breathing was like the wind. When he exhaled, frost formed in the air. When he inhaled, warm air flowed toward him. As Ymir lay there, he began to sweat. The heat from Muspelheim made his body warm. Drops of sweat formed under his left arm. These drops were not ordinary sweat. They carried within them the same force that had created Ymir himself. The drops joined together. They took shape. They became alive. From Ymir's sweat came a male and a female. They were giants like Ymir, but smaller. They were the first children of the first giant. They looked upon their father where he lay. They looked upon the ice and the fire. They looked upon the emptiness. And they lived. More giants came from Ymir as he lay between the worlds of ice and fire. His legs rubbed together, and from them came a sun. This sun had 6 heads, each one able to see in a different direction. He was strange and powerful, born from the magic that flowed through Ymir's ancient body. The giants that came from Ymir were the Jotnar, the old ones, the first people. They multiplied slowly in those early times. They did not age as other beings would later age. Time moved differently for them. A single day for a giant might be 1,000 years for others, or 1,000 years might pass in what felt like a single day. But Ymir needed food. He needed nourishment to sustain his enormous body. And so, from the melting ice, another creature was born. This creature was a cow, but not like any cow that would later walk the earth. She was called Audhumla, and she was as large as Ymir himself. Her coat was white like fresh snow. Her eyes were gentle and old and wise. Audhumla produced 4 rivers of milk. They flowed from her without end, rich and pure and nourishing. Ymir drank from these rivers of milk. The milk sustained him. It gave him strength. It allowed him to continue existing in that space between fire and ice. But Audhumla also needed food. She was a living being, and living beings must eat. She turned to the ice that filled the northern reaches of Ginnungagap. She began to lick the ice with her great tongue. The ice was salty, filled with minerals that had frozen in it. This salt and these minerals nourished her. Audhumla licked the ice for a long time. Her tongue was warm and it melted the ice where she licked. She licked in the same place, over and over. On the first day of her licking, hair began to appear in the ice. It was the hair of something trapped within. Something that had been frozen there since the beginning. On the second day, Audhumla continued to lick. More of the ice melted away. Now a head could be seen. It was the head of a being unlike Ymir, and unlike the giants that had come from him. This head was beautiful and fair and noble. On the third day, Audhumla licked away the last of the ice. A complete being emerged. He was tall and strong and handsome. His name was Beri, and he was the first of the gods. He was not a giant, though he had been born from the same ice that had birthed the giant. There was something different about him, something that set him apart. Buri looked upon the world that existed. He saw Ymir lying in his eternal rest. He saw the giants that had come from Ymir. He saw the ice and the fire, and the emptiness between. And he knew that he had a purpose, though what that purpose was remained unclear. Buri had a son. This son was named Bor, and Bor, in time, took a wife. His wife was named Bestla, and she was the daughter of a giant named Bolthorn. Through this marriage, the line of the gods and the line of the giants became mixed. The blood of both flowed together. Bor and Bestla had 3 sons. Their names were Odin, Vili, and Vit. These 3 brothers would change everything. They would take the ancient world that existed and reshape it into something new. But that is a story for later. For now, in these earliest times, the giants continued to live in the space between ice and fire. They grew in number slowly. They were the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Ymir. They were massive beings, tall as mountains. Their footsteps shook the ice. Their voices echoed through the void like thunder. The giants were not evil in these early days. They simply were. They existed as the mountains exist, as the ice exists, As the fire exists, they were part of the ancient pattern of things. They were older than old, born from the very first moments of creation. They did not build. They did not create. They simply lived in the space that existed. They walked on the ice. They felt the heat from the distant fires. They drank from the rivers that flowed. They were patient in the way that ancient things are patient. They had time. They had always had time. The giants watched as more ice formed. They watched as rivers flowed and froze and flowed again. They saw patterns in the ice, shapes that formed and melted and formed again. They learned the ways of frost and cold. They understood the nature of ice in ways that no other beings would ever understand. Some giants were larger than others. Some were more powerful. Some had strange abilities, gifts that came from their ancient heritage. Some could shape ice with their thoughts. Some could call forth storms of frost. Some could hear the groaning of glaciers from vast distances away. The giants spoke to each other in voices deep and slow. Their language was old, filled with words that described things that no longer exist. They spoke of the void. They spoke of the first melting. They spoke of their ancestor Ymir, who still lay in his place, enormous and ancient. Time passed in the way it passed in those early days, which was not like the passage of time as it would later be known. The giants continued their slow existence. They moved through their realm of ice and myth. They were patient. They were eternal. They did not know that change was coming. They did not know that the three sons of Bor were growing strong. They did not know that the ancient world they knew, the only world that had ever existed, would soon come to an end. The making of the world. The three brothers, Odin, Vili, and Vi, looked upon the world that existed. They saw Ymir lying in his place between ice and fire. They saw the giants who walked in the icy realm. They saw the emptiness that surrounded everything. And they knew that something must change. The brothers spoke among themselves. They made a decision that would alter all of existence. They decided that from the old, they would make something new. They would take what was and transform it into what could be. They approached Ymir where he lay. The first giant did not stir. He remained in his state between sleeping and waking, as he had always been. The brothers raised their weapons. And then, they acted. What happened next was not done with cruelty. It was not done with hate. It was done because the brothers saw that from Ymir's body, an entire world could be made. From his substance, life could flourish in new ways. From his ancient form, creation could take new shape. Ymir fell. His time had come to an end. And from his falling came a flood. The blood poured from Ymir's body in vast torrent. It was not like normal blood. It was the ice-cold waters that had formed him at the beginning. It flowed and rushed and surged. It filled the void. It crashed over the ice. It rose higher and higher. The giants saw the flood coming. They tried to escape. They ran across the ice, their enormous feet creating tremors. But the flood was too vast, too powerful. It caught them. It swept them away. It covered them completely. Almost all the giants drowned in the flood of Ymir's blood. The ancient ones, the firstborn, the children of the first giant, they were washed away. Their voices were silenced. Their footsteps ceased. The ancient world of the giants came to an end. But two giants survived. A giant named Bergelmir and his wife managed to escape the flood. They climbed into a hollowed tree trunk, a vessel that had somehow formed in those early times. They floated on the floodwaters. They rode the surging waves. And they lived. From these two giants, all future giants would descend. The line continued, though it was diminished. The new giants would remember the flood. They would remember how the ancient world had ended. They would remember Ymir, their greatest ancestor. And they would remember that the gods had brought about the death of the first giant. The three brothers began their work of creation. They took Ymir's enormous body, and from it shaped everything that would exist. This was not destruction. This was transformation. The ancient substance of the first giant would become the foundation of all things. From Ymir's flesh, the brothers made the earth. They shaped it and molded it. They spread it out to form land. The flesh became soil and dirt and rock. It became the ground upon which all things would walk. It became the foundation of the world. From Ymir's blood, they made the seas and the lakes and the rivers. The blood, which had flooded everything, now found its proper place. It filled the low places. It surrounded the land they had made. It flowed and moved and lived. The water was cold and deep and vast. From Ymir's bones, the brothers made the mountains. They took the largest bones and stood them upright. They anchored them in the earth. These became the high peaks, the places where the earth reached toward the sky. The bones were strong and would last forever. From Ymir's teeth and broken bone fragments, they made the rocks and stones. These scattered across the land. Some were large boulders, some were small pebbles. They covered the earth in layers, adding texture and variety to the world. From Ymir's hair they made the trees and the plants. Each strand of hair became a tree. The trees grew tall and strong. Their roots dug deep into the earth, made from Ymir's flesh. Their branches reached high. Leaves sprouted. Forests formed. Plants of all kinds covered the land, growing from the substance of the first giant. From Ymir's skull, the brothers made the sky. They lifted the enormous skull high above the earth. They placed it to cover everything. The inside of the skull became the dome of heaven. It arched over the world, vast and encompassing. At the four corners of the skull, the brothers placed 4 dwarves. These dwarves had been born from Ymir's body, like maggots born from flesh. But the brothers gave them consciousness and purpose. The dwarves were named Nordri, Sudri, Austri, and Westri. These names meant north, south, east, and west. The dwarves held up the corners of the sky. They stood at their posts, eternal guardians, keeping the heavens in place. From Ymir's brains, the brothers made the clouds. They took the gray matter and scattered it into the air. The pieces floated and drifted. They gathered moisture. They became the clouds that would travel across the sky, bringing rain and snow to the world below. The brothers took sparks and embers from Muspelheim, from the land of fire. They placed these in the sky. Some they fixed in place, and these became the stars. The stars glittered in the darkness, giving light to the night. Other sparks they set in motion, and these became the sun and the moon. These greater lights would travel across the sky, marking time, bringing day and night to the world. The sun was placed in a chariot. A woman named Sol drove this chariot. She guided the sun across the sky from east to west each day. Behind her ran a great wolf. This wolf was always chasing, always hungry, always seeking to catch the sun. Its name was Skoll. The wolf's pursuit kept the sun moving. It never stopped. It never rested. This was why day followed night, in an endless cycle. The moon was also placed in a chariot. A man named Mani drove the moon. He too traveled across the sky. Behind him ran another wolf named Hati. This wolf chased the moon, just as Skoll chased the sun. The wolves would chase their prey forever, throughout all time. Sometimes they would come close to catching them. When this happened, the sun or moon would grow dark. This was an eclipse. But always, the sun and moon would escape and continue their journey. Around the earth, the brothers placed the sea. Beyond the sea, in a great ring, they placed Jotunheim. This would be the realm of the giants, the home of those who had survived and their descendants. Jotunheim was separated from the world of men and gods by the vast ocean. It was a place apart, a realm of the old ones. In the center of the world, the brothers built Midgard. This would be the realm of humans, though humans had not yet been created. Around Midgard, they built a great wall for protection. This wall was made from Ymir's eyebrows. The eyebrows of the first giant became a barrier, keeping the realm safe from the giants that dwelled beyond. High above Midgard, the brothers built Asgard. This was the realm of the gods. It was beautiful and shining. Great halls stood in Asgard. The largest hall was Valhalla, though it would not be built until later. Asgard was connected to Midgard by a rainbow bridge. This bridge was called Bifrost. It shimmered with all colors. It was both solid and light, both there and not there. In the very center of all things, the brothers discovered a tree. Or perhaps they created it. Or perhaps it had always been there, waiting to be noticed. This tree was called Yggdrasil, the world tree. It was the largest tree that had ever existed or would ever exist. Yggdrasil's roots reached down into 3 different wells. One root reached into Asgard, where it drank from the well of Erd. The Norns, 3 women who wove the fates of all beings, lived by this well. Another root reached into Jotunheim, where it drank from Ymir's well, the well of wisdom. The third root reached into Niflheim, where it drank from Ymir, the roaring cauldron, the same well from which the first rivers had flowed. Yggdrasil's trunk was so wide that a man could walk for days and not circle it. Its bark was rough and ancient. Its wood was harder than any stone. The tree could not be harmed by fire, or ice, or blade, or any force in the world. Yggdrasil's branches reached up past the sky. They spread out to cover all the realms. 9 realms existed in the world, and Yggdrasil connected them all. Its branches provided shelter. Its leaves rustled with the wind. Dew fell from its branches each morning, and this dew was sacred. Many creatures lived in Yggdrasil. An eagle sat at the very top, seeing all things. Between the eagle's eyes sat a hawk. A squirrel ran up and down the trunk, carrying messages and insults between the eagle above and a dragon below. This dragon was called Nidhogg. It gnawed at the roots of the tree. It had gnawed there since the beginning, and would gnaw there until the end. 4 stags ran among the branches, eating the leaves. Their names were Dane, Dwalin, Dunir, and Durathror. The world was now made. It had shape and form. It had land and sea and sky. It had realms for different beings. The substance of Ymir, the first giant, had become everything. His sacrifice, willing or unwilling, had allowed creation to take form. But the giants remembered. Those who had survived the flood, those who had been born after, they all carried the memory. They knew that the world had been made from their ancestor. They knew that the gods had slain Ymir. They knew that the ancient world had ended, so that this new world could begin. This knowledge lived in them. It shaped how they saw the gods. It created a division that would last through all ages. The giants would never forget. They would never fully forgive. And though they sometimes married the gods, though their children sometimes joined the gods in Asgard, there would always be this memory between them. The giants withdrew to Jotunheim. They made it their home. They built their own realm in the way they chose. And they waited. They were patient. They had always been patient. The realm of Jotunheim. Jotunheim stretched across vast distances. It lay beyond the sea, beyond the borders of Midgard, far from the shining halls of Asgard. It was a land unlike any other realm. It was the home of the giants, shaped by their presence and their nature. The landscape of Jotunheim was wild and untamed. Mountains rose to impossible heights. Their peaks pierced the clouds. Their slopes were steep and jagged. Snow covered the highest mountains all year round. The snow never melted. It built up in layers over countless years, forming glaciers that crept slowly down the mountainside. Between the mountains lay deep valleys. Some valleys were narrow, squeezed between sheer cliffs. Others were wide, opening up into vast plains. Rivers ran through many of the valleys. These rivers were cold and swift. They carried meltwater from the glaciers. Their waters were clear and pure and icy. Forests grew in some parts of Jotunheim. These were not gentle forests. The trees grew tall and thick. Their trunks were wider than houses. Their branches intertwined overhead, creating a canopy that blocked out the sun. Moss hung from the branches. The forest floor was covered in ferns and mushrooms, and fallen leaves. Paths through these forests were few walled. Those that existed were old, worn by centuries of use. In other parts of Jotunheim, there were wastelands. Here, no trees grew. No grass covered the ground. These were places of bare rock and ice and wind. The wind howled constantly across these wastelands. It carried snow in the winter and dust in the summer. Nothing could stand against the wind. It eroded everything in its path. There were also regions of fire in Jotunheim. These places were near the borders closest to Muspelheim. Here, volcanoes rose from the earth. Lava flowed slowly down their side. Steam hissed from cracks in the ground. The air shimmered with heat. These fire regions were home to the fire giants, those who had been born with flame in their blood instead of ice. Great rivers crossed Jotunheim. Some flowed calmly. Others rushed and roared. The largest rivers had names. There was the Eleviga, which was not one river, but many. These rivers flowed from Ymir in Niflheim. They carried the same poison that had existed in the beginning. The rivers were cold, beyond cold. Ice formed on their surfaces even in summer. Lakes dotted the landscape of Jotunheim. Some lakes were small, hidden in mountain valleys. Others were vast, like inland sea. The water in these lakes was dark and deep. Strange things lived in their depth. Creatures that had existed since the old times swam in the cold water. The sky above Jotunheim was different from the sky above Midgard or Asgard. Clouds hung lower here. They were thick and gray. Snow fell from them often. Even in summer, snow might fall in the high places. The clouds moved constantly, driven by winds that never stopped. At night, lights danced in the sky above Jotunheim. These were the northern lights. They shimmered green and blue and purple. They waved and flowed like curtains blown by a breeze. The giants knew these lights well. They had watched them since the beginning. Some said the lights were reflections from the shields of the Valkyries as they rode across the sky. Others said they were something older, something from before the world was made. Jotunheim had no true sun like Midgard had. The light that reached Jotunheim was filtered and dim. It came from the sun as it traveled across the sky, but it was weakened by distance and clouds. Days in Jotunheim were gray. Nights were very dark. The giants had eyes that could see in this dimness. They moved through their realm easily, whether in day or night. The seasons in Jotunheim were long. Winter lasted for many months. Snow piled up high. Ice formed on every surface. Rivers froze solid. The giants who preferred cold thrived in this season. They walked through blizzards without feeling them. They swam in icy waters. They climbed frozen waterfalls. Summer in Jotunheim was brief. The snow melted in the lowlands. Flowers bloomed quickly, knowing their time was short. Grass grew green. Birds arrived from the south. The rivers ran high with meltwater. This was a time of motion and life, but it passed quickly. Soon enough, the cold returned. The giants built their homes throughout Jotunheim. Some giants preferred to live in the mountains. They carved holes into the living rock. These halls were vast. A single room might be large enough to hold a human village. The ceilings were high. Columns of stone supported them. The giants decorated their halls with carvings. They made images of the old times, of Ymir, of the creation and the flood. Other giants built their homes in the valleys. They used stone and timber. Their buildings were massive, sized for their enormous bodies. Doors were wide and tall. Halls stretched for long distances. Fires burned in great hearths. Though the giants did not feel cold like smaller beings did, the fires were for light and for cooking. Some giants preferred to live in the wild places. They made no permanent homes. They moved with the seasons. They sheltered in caves when they needed shelter. They slept under the stars. They were the most ancient in their ways, living as the first giants had lived in the time before the world was made. The giants kept animals in Jotunheim. They had cattle, but these were not normal cattle. They were huge, as everything in Jotunheim was huge. A single cow could provide milk enough to fill a lake. The giants also kept goats and horses. The horses of Jotunheim were strong and swift. They could run for days without tiring. Some could run on water. Some could fly through the air. Gardens grew in some parts of Jotunheim. The giants who tended these gardens grew herbs and vegetables. The plants grew large. An apple from Jotunheim was as big as a human's head. A single carrot could feed a family for a week. The giants were skilled gardeners. They knew secrets of growing things in harsh conditions. Rivers and lakes provided fish. The fish in Jotunheim were enormous. They had to be, to provide food for the giants. Some fish were longer than a longship. They were ancient creatures, survivors from the old times. The giants caught them with nets made of woven rope, as thick as a man's arm. The forests of Jotunheim held game. Deer ran through the trees, but they were as large as horses. Elk stood taller than houses. Bears roamed the deep woods. These bears were massive and powerful. Their claws could tear through stone. The giants hunted these animals. They used spears as long as ships' masts. They tracked the animals for days through the forest. Certain places in Jotunheim were special. One such place was Utgard, the outer enclosure. This was the greatest stronghold of the giant. It stood in the heart of Jotunheim. Walls surrounded it. These walls were built from stones so large that 100 men could not move one. The walls rose high. They were thick enough that giants could walk along the top, side by side. Within Utgard were many halls. The largest belonged to Utgard Loki, a mighty giant king. His hall could hold thousands of giants. The roof was supported by columns of carved stone. Tapestries hung on the walls. These tapestries showed scenes from the history of the giants. They showed Ymir in the beginning. They showed the flood. They showed the building of Utgard. Utgard Loki was known for his cleverness. He was a master of magic and illusion. He could make things appear different than they were. He could make the small seem large, and the large seem small. He could make the near seem far, and the far seem near. He used these powers to confuse visitors and to protect his realm. Another special place in Jotunheim was Thrymheim. This was the home of Thiazi, a giant known for his love of eagles. Thiazi could take the form of an eagle. He would fly high above Jotunheim, soaring on the wind. His home was built high in the mountains. To reach it required climbing steep paths. The air there was thin and cold. No, never melted from the peaks around Thrymheim. Thrymheim had many rooms. They were filled with treasures that Thiazi had collected over the centuries. There were golden objects and silver objects. There were gems that glowed with inner light. There were weapons forged in the old times. There were magical objects of great power. Thiazi guarded his treasures carefully. Deep in the mountains of Jotunheim, there were mines. The giants dug into the earth to find metals and gems. They found iron and copper and silver and gold. They found precious stones. The mines went deep, following the veins of ore. The tunnels were tall and wide, sized for giants to walk through. The giants were skilled metal workers. They had forges in their halls. The forges burned hot. The giants hammered metal into shape. They made tools and weapons. They made beautiful objects. Their craftsmanship was excellent, though different from the work of the dwarves who lived under the mountains. The giants' work was large and bold and powerful. Scattered throughout Jotunheim was standing stone. These stones had been placed by the ancient giants. They marked important places. Some marked the sites of great events. Others marked the boundaries between territories. Still, others were placed for reasons long forgotten. The stones were carved with runes. These runes told stories. They recorded knowledge. They preserved the memory of things that had happened long ago. There were wells in Jotunheim. Some were ordinary, providing water for those who lived nearby. Others were special. One such well belonged to Ymir, a being of great wisdom. Mimir's well was located near one of the roots of Yggdrasil. The water in this well contained knowledge. Anyone who drank from it would gain wisdom. But the price for drinking was high. Odin himself had sacrificed one of his eyes to drink from Mimir's well. The borders of Jotunheim were strange places. The realm did not end suddenly. Instead, it faded gradually. The mountains grew taller and more jagged. The cold grew more intense. The winds grew stronger. Eventually, there was nothing but ice and snow and howling wind. Beyond this was the void, the emptiness that existed at the edges of all things. On the border between Jotunheim and Midgard, there were certain crossing points. These were places where travel between the realms was possible. Most were guarded. The giants watched them carefully. They did not want unwelcome visitors. The gods had their own ways of traveling between realms. But for others, these crossing points were the only way. The ocean that surrounded Midgard and separated it from Jotunheim was vast and cold. A great serpent lived in this ocean. This was Jormungandr, the world serpent. It was one of the children of Loki. The serpent grew so large that it encircled all of Midgard. It held its own tail in its mouth. It lay on the ocean floor, and its body created currents and whirlpools. When it shifted, waves rose. When it was hungry, it rose to the surface and swallowed whales whole. Some giants lived near the ocean. They built their homes on cliffs, overlooking the water. They were familiar with the sea. They built boats, though these boats were as large as islands. They sailed on the ocean, fishing and exploring. They knew the ways of the currents and the tides. They knew when storms would come. They knew where the serpent lay. In the far north of Jotunheim, there was a region called Ironwood. This was a dark forest, twisted and ancient. Strange beings lived in Ironwood. The trees there were not like other trees. They had metal in their bark. When the wind blew, the trees creaked and groaned like rusty hinges. Little grew on the forest floor. The place had an oppressive feeling. Giantesses made their home in Ironwood. These were not ordinary giantesses. They had the ability to transform into wolves. Their children were wolves, but not normal wolves. These wolves were huge and fierce. Some would play important roles in the fate of the world. Fenrir, the great wolf, had connections to these wolf mothers of Ironwood. Throughout Jotunheim, there were caves. Some caves were small. Others were vast systems that went deep underground. The caves stayed the same temperature all year. Some giants preferred to live in caves. They liked the darkness and the coolness. They liked being surrounded by stone. In some caves, there were hot springs. Water heated by the earth bubbled up. Steam filled these caves. The water was pleasant, even for giants who did not feel cold. They would bathe in these springs. They would sit in the warm water and rest. The springs had minerals in them that were good for health and strength. Crystals grew in some of the caves. These crystals were enormous. They jutted from the walls and ceiling and floor. Some were clear as ice. Others were colored, glowing with soft light. The giants valued these crystals. They used them in their magic. They carved them into tools and ornaments. The wildlife of Jotunheim was varied. Besides the large animals that the giants hunted, there were smaller creatures. Birds nested in the cliffs and forests. Their songs echoed through the valleys. Foxes ran through the snow. Rabbits hopped through the meadows in summer. Wolves hunted in packs. Their howls could be heard at night, long and mournful. Strange creatures also lived in Jotunheim Ponto. Some were left over from the old times, from before the world was made. Others were created by giant magic. There were creatures that were part animal and part something else. There were beasts that could not be named because they were unique, the only ones of their kind. The giants themselves were varied in appearance. Some looked much like the gods, only larger. They had the same basic form, with 2 arms and 2 legs and 1 head. They could be handsome or beautiful. Others were more monstrous. They might have multiple heads. They might have strange proportions. Some had skin like stone. Others had skin like ice. Some giants were covered in hair. Their hair was thick and kept them warm. It might be white or black or brown or red. Other giants had smooth skin. Some had patterns on their skin, marks that showed their lineage or their deed. The giants lived long lives. They did not age as humans aged. A giant might live for thousands of years and still be considered young. The oldest giants remembered the time of the flood. They remembered the old world. They carried this memory and passed it down to their children. Families were important to the giants. They kept track of their lineage carefully. They knew who their ancestors were going back many generations. They told stories of their forebears. These stories were their history. They were passed down orally from parent to child, keeping the memory alive. The giants married and had children. Sometimes they married other giants. Sometimes they married beings from other realms. Several giants had married gods. Their children were often powerful, Having the strength of giants and the gifts of God, children in Jotunheim grew slowly. A giant child might take 100 years to reach maturity. During this time, they learned the ways of their people. They learned to survive in the harsh land. They learned the history and the stories. They learned skills like hunting and building and forging. The giants gathered for feasts. These were important events. All the giants in a region would come together. They would bring food and drink. They would share news. They would tell stories. They would sing songs. The feasts would last for days. At these feasts, the giants would compete in contests. They would test their strength by lifting enormous stones. They would race across the land. They would wrestle. These contests were friendly, a way to show prowess and to earn respect. The giants also told riddles at their feasts. Riddles were valued among the giants. A good riddle showed cleverness. The giants would challenge each other with difficult riddles. The one who could answer the most riddles earned honor. Music filled the feast halls. The giants played instruments. They had drums made from hollowed logs. They had horns made from the horns of great beasts. They had harps with strings as thick as ropes. The music was deep and resonant. It shook the very walls. The giants sang song. Their voices were powerful. When many giants sang together, the sound could be heard across great distances. Their songs told of the old times. They sang of Ymir and the creation. They sang of heroes among the giants. They sang of love and loss and adventure. Dancing also happened at the feasts. The giants would dance in circles. Their footsteps would shake the ground. The dances were ancient, passed down from the earliest time. Each step had meaning. The dancers told stories through movement. The giants brewed their own drink. They made mead from honey. The bees in Jotunheim were large, like everything else. They made honey in quantities that could fill barrels. The giants fermented this honey into mead. The mead was strong and sweet. A single cup could make a human drunk, but the giants could drink great quantities. Some giants had special roles in their society. There were leaders, those who made decisions for their communities. There were wise ones, those who remembered the old knowledge. There were warriors, those who protected the realm. There were craftspeople, those who made the things that were needed. Magic was common among the giants. Many had the ability to use magic. Their magic was different from the magic of the gods. It was older, more primal. It was connected to the elements, to ice and stone and storm. Some giants could shapeshift. They could take the form of animals. Eagles were common. Some could become bears. Others could become wolves or fish or serpents. When in animal form, they had all the abilities of that animal, but they kept their intelligence and memory. Weather magic was another gift some giants possessed. They could call storms. They could make snow fall. They could bring fog so thick that nothing could be seen. They could calm the winds or make them rage. This magic came naturally to them, a part of their heritage from the ice and mist of Niflheim. Some giants could see the future. They had visions of things that had not yet happened. These visions were not always clear. They came in dreams or in moments of stillness. The giants who had this gift were respected. Others would come to them for guidance. Healing magic was practiced by certain giants. They knew herbs and their uses. They knew words of power that could mend wounds. They could set bones and cure sicknesses. Their knowledge was vast, accumulated over centuries of life. The giants had a complex relationship with the gods. There was tension because of Ymir's death. There was wariness because the gods held power. But there was also connection. Some giants had married into the Azar. Some were friends with certain gods. Trade happened between Asgard and Jotunheim. Thor, the god of thunder, often came to Jotunheim. He came to fight giants who threatened the other realms. His hammer Mjolnir had slain many giants over the ages. The giants knew Thor well. They feared his hammer. They knew that when thunder rolled, Thor might be coming. But not all interactions with Thor were violent. Sometimes he came on peaceful errands. Sometimes he was tricked into coming. The giants respected Thor's strength, even as they opposed him. He was a worthy opponent, and there was honor in matching strength with him. Loki, The trickster god had giant blood. His father was Faboti, a giant. His mother was Laufey, also called Nal. Loki moved between the worlds easily. He was accepted in Asgard, and also in Jotunheim. He was clever and cunning. He had caused both problems and solutions for all realms. The giants were connected to the cycles of nature. They understood the turning of seasons. They knew when winter would come and when it would end. They watched the movements of sun and moon and stars. They saw patterns in these movements. Time moved differently for the giant. A day for them might feel like a moment. A year might pass in what seemed like a week. This was part of their ancient nature. They were connected to the slow time of mountains and glaciers, not the quick time of smaller, shorter-lived beings. The giants kept libraries of a sort. They did not have books as humans would later have. Instead, they had stones carved with runes. They had wooden tablets. They had memories that stretched back centuries. The knowledge they preserved was vast. They knew the true names of things. They knew the names that had been given at the beginning. Names had power, and the giants understood this. They guarded certain names carefully, knowing that to speak them was to call upon ancient forces. The giants understood the structure of the world. They knew about the 9 realms. They knew about Yggdrasil. They knew the paths between worlds. This knowledge was important. It allowed them to navigate the cosmos. They knew about fate. The Norns wove fate for all beings, even for giants and gods. The giants accepted this. They knew that certain things were destined to happen. They knew that the world would not last forever. They knew about Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, though it lay far in the future. Prophecies spoke of Ragnarok. When that time came, the giants would march against the god. They would cross the rainbow bridge. They would bring fire and destruction. The world would end in a great battle. Both gods and giants would fall. The world would sink into the sea and then rise again, renewed. But that was in the future. In the present, life continued in Jotunheim. The giants lived their lives. They went about their days. They worked and rested. They loved and lost. They built and created. They were part of the great pattern of existence, the giants and their ways. The morning came to Jotunheim as it always did, slowly and gently. The light grew in the eastern sky. It was a gray light, filtered through cloud. The giants who were awake watched the light increase. They greeted the new day in their own ways. Some giants rose early. They were the ones who had tasks to complete. They went to tend their animal. They went to check their trap. They went to work in their forges or at their crafts. They moved through their morning routines, familiar patterns worn smooth by repetition. Other giants slept late. They had no pressing tasks. Time was different for them, and sleep was a pleasure. They might sleep for days and then be awake for weeks. Their internal rhythms followed ancient patterns that had nothing to do with the sun's daily movement. Food was important to the giants, though they did not need to eat as often as smaller beings. When they did eat, they ate large amounts. A giant's breakfast might include whole fish, caught fresh from the lake. It might include great rounds of bread, baked in ovens as large as rooms. It might include fruit, each piece as large as a human's head. The giants prepared their food in various ways. Some preferred raw fish. Others cooked their food over fires. They roasted meat on spits. They baked bread in stone ovens. They boiled vegetables in great cauldrons. The smells of cooking would drift through their halls and out into the valley. Water was always available. The giants drank from streams and rivers. The water was pure and cold. Some giants preferred mead or ale. These drinks were kept in barrels in cool cellars. The giants would draw from the barrels when they wanted to drink. After eating, the giants would begin their work. Those who were craftspeople would go to their workshop. A blacksmith giant would stoke his forge. The coals would glow red and then white with heat. He would select a piece of metal. He would heat it until it was soft. Then he would begin to hammer it into shape. The ringing of hammer on anvil was a common sound in Jotunheim. It echoed through valleys and mountains. Each strike of the hammer was carefully placed. The giant smith would work for hours, shaping the metal. He would make a tool or a weapon, or a piece of jewelry. Each piece was made with skill accumulated over centuries. A weaver giant would sit at her loom. The loom was enormous, sized for her large hand. The threads were thick and strong. She would pass the shuttle back and forth, creating cloth. The patterns she wove were complex. They told stories or showed images from nature. The finished cloth would be beautiful and durable. A potter giant would work with clay. The clay came from deposits in the earth. It was dug up and prepared. The potter would place a large lump of clay on his wheel. The wheel was powered by his foot, pushing a pedal. As the wheel spun, the potter would shape the clay with his hands. He would make pots and bowls and jars. After shaping, they would be left to dry and then fired in a kiln. Farmers among the giants would tend their field. In the brief summer, crops grew quickly. The giants would plant seeds. They would water and weed. They would watch over the growing plants. When harvest time came, they would gather the crop. Grain was cut with sickles and scythes. Vegetables were pulled from the earth. Everything was stored for the long winter. Herders would take their animals to pasture. The cattle and goats and sheep would graze in meadows. The herder would watch over them. He would count them to make sure none were lost. He would check them for injuries or sickness. At the end of the day, he would guide them back to shelter. Hunters would prepare for their hunts. They would check their weapons. Spears would be sharpened. Arrows would be fletched. Bows would be strung. The hunters would plan where to go. They would discuss which game to pursue. Then they would set out into the wilderness. Hunting in Jotunheim required skill and patience. The animals were large and could be dangerous. A giant hunter might track a great elk for days through the forest. He would read signs in the snow or mud. A broken branch here, a hoofprint there. He would move quietly, despite his size. When the hunter found his prey, he would wait for the right moment. He needed a clear shot. He would draw his bow or raise his spear. Then, he would strike. If his aim was true, the animal would fall. If he missed, he might track it for days more. After a successful hunt, the hunter would prepare the kill. He would thank the animal for its sacrifice. This was important. The giants respected the animals they hunted. They knew that all life was connected. They would butcher the animal, using every part. The meat would feed his family. The hide would become clothing or shelter. The bones would become tools. Fishers would go to the rivers and lakes. They carried nets or lines. They would cast the nets into the water. They would wait patiently. When they felt a pull, they would haul in the net. Fish would be threshing inside. The fisher would sort the catch, keeping the good fish and releasing the small ones. Some giants fished from boats. These boats were carved from single trees. The trees used were the largest in the forest. The boats were long and wide. They could hold several giants. They had oars as long as tree trunk. The giants would row out onto the lake. They would drop their lines deep into the water. The deepest lakes had the largest fish. Some of these fish were ancient. They had lived for centuries in the dark depths. When a giant caught one of these ancient fish, it was considered very lucky. The fish would provide meat for many meals. Some giants were explorers. They traveled through Jotunheim, mapping the land. They would climb mountains that had never been climbed. They would cross wastelands that had never been crossed. They would enter caves that had never been entered. They sought new knowledge, new places, new experiences. These explorers would be gone for long periods. They might travel for years before returning home. When they returned, they would have stories to tell. They would describe what they had seen. They would tell of strange creatures and beautiful vistas and dangerous passages. Others would listen eagerly to these tales. Sholas among the giants studied various subjects. Some studied the stars. They watched the movements of heavenly bodies. They could predict when eclipses would occur. They knew the paths of planets. They understood celestial patterns that others did not see. Other scholars studied herbs and plants. They would go into the forests and fields. They would gather samples. They would test the properties of different plants. They would learn which ones could heal and which ones could harm. This knowledge was carefully recorded and passed down. Some scholars studied history. They memorized the old stories. They learned the genealogies of all the great giant families. They could recite the deeds of heroes from long ago. They were living libraries, preserving knowledge in their memories. Magic users among the giants practiced their arts. They would go to quiet places to meditate. They would seek visions. They would perform rituals. These rituals were ancient, passed down from the first giant. They involved runes and chants and gestures. A giant sorcerer might draw runes in the earth. Each rune had meaning and power. When arranged in the right way, they could produce effect. The sorcerer would chant over the runes. The chant would be in the old language, the language of the first giant. Power would build. Then, the magic would be released. Some magic was subtle. A spell to help crops grow. A spell to find water underground. A spell to calm a frightened animal. Other magic was dramatic. A spell to call lightning from the sky. A spell to split stone. A spell to create illusions that could fool anyone. The giants taught their young the ways of magic. A young giant with potential would be apprenticed to an older sorcerer. The training would take many years. The young giant would learn the runes. They would learn the chants. They would learn to sense and control the magical energies. Throughout the day, giants would interact with each other. They would meet on the paths between settlements. They would greet each other. They would stop to talk. News would be exchanged. Information would be shared. These casual meetings were how information spread through Jotunheim. Sometimes disputes would arise. Two giants might disagree about boundaries or about the ownership of something. When this happened, they would bring their dispute to a council. The elders of the community would hear both sides. They would consider the arguments. Then they would make a judgment. The giants valued fairness. They wanted disputes to be resolved justly. The judgment of the elders was respected. Both parties would accept the decision. This system had kept peace among the giants for ages. In the afternoon, as the gray light began to fade, giants would gather for socializing. They would meet at someone's hall. They would sit around the fire. They would talk about their day. They would share stories. They would laugh together. Children would play during these gatherings. Young giants had energy to burn. They would run and jump and wrestle. Their play was loud and boisterous. The adults would watch fondly, remembering their own youth. The children played games that were ancient. One game involved throwing stones at a target. The stone had to be thrown from a great distance. The child who came closest to the target won. Another game involved hiding and seeking. The children would hide in the vast halls or out in the landscape. Finding them could take a long time. As evening approached, the light faded quickly. The long northern nights were beginning. The giants would light fires and lamps. Fire was used for light more than warmth. The giants did not feel cold as other beings did, but they appreciated the light and the cheer that fire brought. Meals were shared in the evening. Families would eat together. They would sit around a large table. Food would be served. They would eat slowly, enjoying the meal and the company. Conversation would flow around the table. After the evening meal, there would be time for leisure. Some giants would work on crafts. A woman might sew or embroider. A man might carve wood or bone. These were quiet activities done by firelight. Others would play games. There were board games that the giants played. One involved moving pieces across a board, trying to capture the opponent's pieces. It required strategy and foresight. Games could last for hours or even days. Music was often part of the evening. Someone would bring out an instrument. They would begin to play. Others might join in, singing or playing other instruments. The music would fill the hall. It would drift out into the night. Stories were told in the evenings. This was one of the most important activities. An elder would begin a story. Everyone would settle in to listen. The story might be one they had heard before, but they would listen as if hearing it for the first time. The stories were the history and soul of the giant. They told of the creation and the flood. They told of great heroes and their deeds. They told of love and betrayal. They told of quests and adventures. They told of encounters with gods and other beings. The storyteller would use different voices for different characters. They would gesture to emphasize point. They would pause at dramatic moments. The audience would react, gasping or laughing, or sitting in silence depending on the story. Young giants would listen carefully. They were learning these stories. One day, they would tell them to their own children. This was how the culture was preserved, through oral tradition, through the speaking and listening and remembering. When the story was finished, there would be a moment of silence. Everyone would sit with the story, thinking about its meaning. Then, someone might ask the storyteller to tell another, or the evening might wind down, with people preparing for sleep. Sleep came at different times for different giants. Some went to bed early, others stayed up late. Some did not sleep at night at all, being awake in the darkness and sleeping during the day. Each giant followed their own rhythm. Beds in Jotunheim were enormous. They were made of wood, carved and sturdy. Mattresses were stuffed with wool or feathers or dried grass. Blankets were thick and heavy. A giant would settle into bed, pulling the blankets up. The halls would grow quiet. Fires would burn down to coals. The only sounds would be the wind outside, and perhaps the distant howl of wolves. The giants would drift into sleep, their breathing slow and deep. In sleep, giants sometimes had dreams. These dreams could be meaningful. They might show the future. They might bring messages from the spirit. They might connect the dreamer to the past. The giants paid attention to their dreams. In the morning, they might discuss them, trying to understand their meaning. And so, the day would end in Jotunheim. Night would cover the land. The stars would appear, bright in the clear cold air. The northern lights might dance. The world would rest. Tomorrow would come, and the cycle would begin again. The magic of the giant. Magic flowed through Jotunheim like water through a river. It was in the air and the earth. It was in the ice and the stone. The giants were born with this magic in their blood. It was their heritage from Ymir, from the first moments of creation when ice and fire met. The magic of the giants was not like the magic of the god. The god's magic was refined, controlled, shaped by will and word. The giant's magic was wilder, more primal. It came from deep sources, from the bones of the world itself. Every giant had some touch of magic. In some, it was strong. In others, it was weak. But all could sense it. They could feel the currents of power that flowed through the world. They could tap into these currents if they knew how. The runes were one way. The giants used magic. Runes were symbols, each one carrying meaning and power. There were many runes. Each had a name. Each had associations with concepts and forces. The runes had been discovered, not invented. They had always existed as part of the structure of reality. Odin had discovered them by hanging on Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights. But the giants had known runes before Odin's discovery. They had learned them from older sources, from the very patterns of creation. A giant who wanted to work rune magic would carve the runes into wood or stone. The material mattered. Different materials had different properties. The runes would be carved carefully. Each line had to be exact. A mistake could change the meaning or render the rune powerless. After carving, the runes would be colored, usually with red dye or blood. This added power to them. Then the giant would speak over them. The speaking was done in a chant, in words from the old language. The chant activated the runes, bringing their power to life. Simple rune magic could bring luck or protection. A rune carved over a doorway would protect the home. A rune carved on a weapon would make it strike true. A rune carved on a ship would keep it safe on the water. More complex rune magic could do greater things. Multiple runes could be combined into bind runes, symbols that held the power of several runes at once. These were more difficult to make, but more powerful. A bind rune might heal a sickness that a single rune could not. It might ward off a curse. It might ensure success in a difficult venture. The most skilled rune masters could create entire systems of runes. They would carve them in patterns that connected to each other. These patterns could produce remarkable effects. They could change weather. They could strengthen or weaken. They could reveal hidden things. Shape-shifting was another form of giant magic. Many giants could take animal forms. This ability came naturally to them. It was part of their fluid nature, their connection to the primal forces of creation. To shapeshift, a giant would focus their will. They would imagine the form they wanted to take. They would feel their body changing. Bones would shift. Skin would transform. Size would alter. The process took only moments. In animal form, the giant had all the abilities of that animal. As an eagle, they could fly. They could see great distances. They could soar on thermal current. As a bear, they had great strength and sharp claws. As a wolf, they could run swiftly and track by scent. But the giant kept their own mind. They could think and reason. They remembered who they were. They could choose to change back whenever they wished. Some giants could hold an animal form for years. Others would change back after a few hours, finding it tiring to maintain the transformation. Some shapeshifters could take many forms. They were not limited to one animal. These multi-form shifters were rare and powerful. They had mastered the magic of transformation completely. They could become anything they could imagine. Weather magic was common among ice giants. They had an affinity for cold and storm. A weather worker could feel the patterns in the air. They could sense where storms were forming. They could predict changes in the weather. To work weather magic, the giant would reach out with their mind. They would touch the clouds and the winds. They would push and pull, guiding the weather. A small push might make a storm grow stronger. A pull might disperse clouds. Creating a storm from nothing was difficult. It required tremendous power. The weather worker would need to gather moisture from the air. They would need to cool it, form clouds, create winds. The effort would be exhausting, but the result would be impressive. A storm that could rage for days. Snow magic was easier for ice giants. Snow was their element. They could make it fall from clear skies. They could shape it into forms. They could make snowflakes as large as shields or as small as dust. They could create blizzards that would bury entire valleys. Some giants could create living snow. They would shape snow into the form of a creature. Then they would breathe life into it. The snow creature would move and act, following the giant's commands. These creatures would last until they melted, or until the magic was withdrawn. Ice magic was similar to snow magic, but more difficult. Ice was harder, more stable. An ice mage could freeze water instantly. They could create walls of ice. They could make weapons of ice, swords and spears that were as hard as steel and never melted. Advanced ice mages could create complex structures. They could build castles of ice, complete with rooms and corridors. They could make ice that was clear as glass or colored like gems. They could control the very temperature around them, creating zones of intense cold. Stone magic was practiced by mountain giants. They had a connection to the earth and rock. They could sense the structure of stone. They could find weaknesses in rock faith. They could shape stone with their minds. A stone mage could cause rocks to crumble or fuse together. They could make passages through solid stone. They could cause rock slides or prevent them. In their hands, stone became as malleable as clay. Some stone mages could speak to the earth itself. They would place their hands on the ground and listen. The earth would tell them things. Where water could be found, where ore was located, where caves ran beneath the surface. This knowledge was valuable. Plant magic was practiced by some giants, particularly those who lived in the forested region. They could encourage plants to grow. A spell song sung over a seed would make it sprout and grow to maturity in days instead of months. They could make trees bend without breaking. They could cause vines to grow and move where they directed. Healing magic was a valued skill. Healers could mend wounds and cure sicknesses. They used a combination of herbs and magic. The herbs provided physical healing. The magic enhanced this, speeding the process and ensuring it worked. A healer would first examine the sick or injured. They would determine what was wrong. Then they would prepare a remedy. This might be a tea made from herbs. It might be a poultice applied to a wound. As they worked, they would chant healing words. The words carried power that would flow into the patient. For serious injuries, more intensive magic was needed. The healer might place their hands over the wound. They would pour their own life force into the injured person. This would knit flesh and bone back together, but it was tiring for the healer. They would need time to recover their strength afterward. Illusion magic was practiced by the cleverest giant. They could make things appear different than they were. They could make the small seem large, or the large seem small. They could hide things, or make things appear that were not there. Utgard Loki was a master of illusion. When Thor and Loki and their companions visited his hall, he used illusions to trick them. He made a cat appear to be a cat when it was actually the world serpent. He made an old woman appear feeble when she was actually old age itself, which no one can defeat. His illusions were so convincing that even the gods were fooled. Creating illusions required understanding of perception. The illusion maker had to know how others perceived the world. Then they could alter those perceptions. The magic worked on the mind, making it see what was not there, or fail to see what was there. Divination was practiced by giants with the sight. They could see things that were hidden. They could see into the past or the future. They could see into other realms. This gift was both blessing and curse, for some things were better left unseen. A seer would enter a trance state. They might stare into a fire or into water. They might sit in darkness with their eyes closed. In the trance, visions would come. The visions were often symbolic, not literal. Interpreting them required wisdom and experience. The future the seers saw was not fixed. It was one possible future among many. Choices could change outcomes, but some events seemed inevitable. These were the threads of fate woven by the Norns, which even gods and giants could not alter. Curse magic existed, but was used sparingly. A curse was dangerous to cast. It could rebound on the caster if done improperly. But when enemies needed to be dealt with from a distance, curses were effective. A curse would be spoken or written. It would name the target and describe the harm intended. The curse would be powered by the caster's will and by sacrifices made. Blood was often used, or valued possessions that were destroyed. The curse would seek its target unerringly. When it found them, it would bring the harm that had been specified. This might be sickness or bad luck or nightmares or any number of afflictions. Breaking a curse was difficult, requiring equally powerful magic. Ward magic was the opposite of curses. Wards protected. They could be placed on people or objects or locations. A ward would keep harm away. It would deflect curses. It would alert the ward maker if something tried to break through. Wards were made by creating a barrier of magical energy. The barrier could be visible or invisible. It would surround whatever was being protected. Anything harmful that tried to cross the barrier would be stopped or weakened. Creating strong wards required time and skill. The ward maker would walk around the area to be protected. They would trace the boundary. They would place markers at key points. Then they would weave the magical barrier, connecting the markers. The result would be a protective shell. Summoning magic allowed giants to call creatures to them. They might summon birds to carry messages. They might summon wolves to aid in hunting. They might summon spirits to answer questions. The summons was done through chants and offerings. The creature being summoned could refuse. Free will existed, even for animals and spirits. But if the offering was good and the need genuine, most would come. They would help as they were able. Then they would be released to return to their own business. Some giants specialized in speaking with the dead. This was called necromancy, though it was not the dark art that some believed. The dead had knowledge. They had seen and experienced things. Speaking with them could provide guidance. To speak with the dead, the necromancer would go to a place of death. This might be a burial ground or a battlefield. They would call out, using the names of those they wished to speak with. If the spirit was willing, it would manifest. It might appear visibly, or simply speak in the necromancer's mind. The dead did not always give clear answers. They existed in a different state. Their concerns were not the concerns of the living. They might speak in riddles or refuse to speak at all. But when they did provide information, it was usually truthful. Dream magic was subtle but powerful. A dream worker could enter the dreams of others. They could observe what was dreamed. They could influence dreams, changing them. They could implant suggestions that the dreamer would remember upon waking. Dream magic was used for various purposes. It could be used for healing by giving therapeutic dreams. It could be used for teaching by presenting lessons in dream form. It could be used for communication by meeting another person in a shared dream. Some giants could leave their bodies in dreams. Their spirit would travel while their body slept. They could go to distant places. They could see what was happening there. They could even interact with things on a spiritual level, though not on a physical one. Blood magic was powerful, but demanding. It used blood as a source of power. The blood could come from the caster or from others. Animal blood was common. The blood contained life force, which could be channeled into magic. Blood magic could create strong bonds. A pact sealed with blood was unbreakable. Blood, mixed between two beings, created a connection that would last forever. Blood could also be used to track someone. A drop of their blood would always point toward them, no matter how far away they went. The giants knew that all magic had limits. No magic was all-powerful. Every spell required energy. That energy had to come from somewhere. It might come from the caster's own life force. It might come from the environment. It might come from sacrifices made. Using too much magic was dangerous. A giant who pushed too hard could exhaust themselves completely. They might fall into a deep sleep from which they would not wake for days. In extreme cases, they might die. The body could only channel so much power before it burned out. Magic also required knowledge. A spell needed to be done correctly. The runes needed to be carved right. The chant needed to be spoken without error. The gestures needed to be precise. Mistakes could cause the spell to fail. Worse, they could cause it to go wrong in unexpected ways. Some giants spent their entire lives studying one type of magic. They would master every aspect of it. They would learn all the nuances. They would become experts that others would come to for help or teaching. Others preferred to know a little about many types of magic. They were generalists. They might not be masters of any one thing, but they had flexibility. They could adapt to different situations. Magic schools existed in Jotunheim. These were not buildings, but rather traditions of teaching. A master would take on students. The students would live with the master for years, learning. They would practice daily. They would study the old texts and runestone. They would listen to the master's stories and lessons. When a student had learned enough, they would face a test. The test was different for each school and each type of magic. It would challenge the student to demonstrate their knowledge and skill. If they passed, they would be recognized as a practitioner. If they failed, they would continue their studies. Some giants never stopped learning. Even masters continued to discover new things about magic. They would experiment. They would combine different types of magic. They would push boundaries. Magic was vast, and there was always more to know. The giants believed that magic was a gift. It had been given to them by the universe itself. They should use it wisely. They should respect it. They should never take it for granted. The ancient trees and sacred places. Throughout Jotunheim, there were places that held special power. These places had been marked by ancient events. They had been touched by great magic. They had been sites of important moments in giant history. The giants knew these places. They treated them with respect. One such place was the first grove. This was a forest that had grown from the first seeds to fall to earth after the world was made. The trees here were old beyond measure. Their trunks were massive. Their roots dug deep into the earth, touching the very bones of the world. The first grove was quiet. Sound seemed muffled there. When someone spoke, their voice did not carry far. The trees absorbed the sound. Walking through the grove felt like walking through a sacred space. Many giants went there to think or to meditate, or to seek visions. The trees in the first grove had names. Each one was known individually. The oldest tree stood in the center. It was called Grandmother. Its trunk was so wide that 10 giants holding hands could not circle it. Its branches spread out to cover a vast area. Birds nested in those branches. Squirrels ran along them. The tree was a world unto itself. Giants would come to grandmother to ask for wisdom. They would place their hand on the trunk. They would speak their question aloud, or hold it in their heart. Then they would wait. Sometimes an answer would come immediately. Sometimes it would come later, in a dream or a sudden realization. Another sacred place was the stone circle. This was a ring of standing stones on a high plateau. The stones were tall, 3 times the height of a giant. They had been placed there in the ancient times. No one remembered who had placed them or exactly why. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle. They were evenly spaced. Each stone had been shaped, though it was hard to tell how. They were smooth and straight. Runes were carved on some of them, but the runes were so old that their meaning had been forgotten. The stone circle was a place of power. Magic worked more easily there. Spells cast within the circle were stronger. Rituals performed there had greater effects. The giants used the stone circle for important magical workings. 4 times a year, at the solstices and equinoxes, giants would gather at the stone circle. They would hold ceremonies to mark the turning of the season. They would give thanks for the gifts of the earth. They would ask for blessings for the season to come. The ceremonies were led by the eldest and most respected giant. They would stand in the center of the circle. They would speak the old words. They would make offerings. The offerings might be mead poured on the ground. They might be grain scattered to the winds. They might be flowers laid at the base of the stone. As the sun rose or set, aligning with the stones in ways that only happened on those special days, power would fill the circle. The giants would feel it. It would flow through them. They would be renewed by it. The connection between earth and sky and all living things would be reaffirmed. The crystal caves were another sacred place. These caves were deep in the mountains. To reach them required a difficult climb. The entrance was hidden. Only those who knew where to look could find it. Inside the caves, crystals grew in abundance. They were enormous. Some were taller than giants. They jutted from walls and ceiling and floor. They were clear or colored in every shade imaginable. Light that entered the cave was refracted and reflected by the crystals, creating a display of beauty. The crystal caves were a place of clarity. Giants who were confused or troubled would go there. They would sit among the crystals. The vibrations of the crystals would calm their minds. The beauty would soothe their soul. After a time, the answer to their trouble would become clear. The caves were also a place of visions. Some giants would enter the deepest chambers and meditate for days. In the silence and the subtle light, visions would come. These visions were usually profound. They might show the seeker their true path. They might reveal hidden aspects of themselves. They might connect the seeker to the great patterns of existence. High in the mountains was the Peak of Winds. This was the tallest mountain in Jotunheim. Its peak was always wrapped in clouds. The wind there never stopped. It howled and roared constantly. The Peak of Winds was sacred to the wind and the sky. Giants who wanted to learn weather magic would make the pilgrimage to the peak. The climb was dangerous. The wind could knock even a giant off the narrow path. But those who reached the summit would be rewarded. At the summit, the giants would stand in the wind. They would let it buffet them. They would feel its power. They would listen to its voice. The wind would teach them. It would show them how it moved, how it gathered force, how it shaped weather. After hours or days on the peak, the giant would descend with new understanding. Some giants would build small cairns on the peak. These cairns were made from stones, stacked carefully. Each visitor would add a stone. Over time, the cairns grew. They stood as markers of all who had made the pilgrimage. The Whispering Lake was a place of mysteries. This lake was perfectly round. Its water was perfectly still. No wind ever rippled its surface. No streams fed into it. No streams flowed out. The water level never changed. The Whispering Lake got its name from the voices. Anyone who stood at its shore would hear whispers. The whispers seemed to come from the water. They were too quiet to understand, but they were definitely there. Some said the whispers were the voices of spirit. Others said they were echoes of all the words ever spoken by the lake. Giants would come to the whispering lake when they needed guidance. They would sit by the shore. They would listen to the whispers. Sometimes, among the unintelligible murmurs, they would hear something clear. A word. A phrase. It would be exactly what they needed to hear. The lake was also a place of scrying. A seer could look into the still water and see visions. The water acted as a window. It would show things happening far away. It would show things from the past. It would show possibilities of the future. In the far reaches of Jotunheim was the field of memory. This was a plain covered in white flowers. The flowers grew nowhere else. They bloomed year-round, even in winter. Their scent was sweet and strong. The field of memory was where the giants remembered their dead. When a giant died, their kin would bring something of theirs to the field. This might be a possession the giant had loved. It might be a lock of their hair. It would be placed among the flowers. The flowers would preserve the memory of the dead. Their names would not be forgotten as long as the flowers bloomed. Giants would visit the field to remember. They would walk among the flowers. They would speak the names of those who had passed. They would tell stories about them. The field was peaceful. It was a place of gentle sorrow, but also of acceptance. Death was part of life. The giants knew this. They did not rage against death. They honored it. The field of memory was how they did that. Deep within a forest was the well of stories. This well was ancient. Its water was clear and cold. But the remarkable thing about the well was that it remembered stories. A giant could come to the well and speak a story into it. The story would be absorbed by the water. Later, another giant could come and listen. They would lower a cup into the well and drink. As they drank, they would hear the story. It would play in their mind as if someone were telling it to them. The well held countless stories. Some were thousands of years old. They had been told by giants long dead. The well preserved them perfectly. Not a word was lost. Not a detail was changed. Young giants would often visit the well of stories. They would drink deep, hearing story after story. This was how they learned their history and culture. The well was a teacher that never tired and never forgot. Near the border with Niflheim was the ice garden. This was a place where ice formed in strange and beautiful shapes. The shapes looked like flowers and trees and animals. They were delicate and intricate. They sparkled in the dim light. The ice garden was created by the meeting of cold from Niflheim and warmth from other parts of Jotunheim. The temperature was precisely balanced. In this balance, ice could form in ways it could not elsewhere. The ice garden changed constantly. New formations would appear. Old ones would melt away. No two visits to the garden were the same. Giants would come to see what new wonders had formed. They would marvel at the delicate beauty. The garden was a reminder that even in harshness, beauty could exist. Even in cold and ice, there could be grace. The giants took this lesson to heart. It shaped how they saw their world. On the coast, where Jotunheim met the sea, was the Echo Cliff. This was a sheer rock face that rose straight up from the water. It was hundreds of feet tall. The cliff had unusual acoustic properties. If someone called out from the base of the cliff, their voice would echo back. But the echo was not normal. It would sound like many voices. The single call would return as a chorus. The effect was eerie and beautiful. The Echo Cliff was used for making oaths. When a giant wanted to swear an important oath, they would come to the cliff. They would speak their oath loudly. The cliff would echo it back, many-voiced. This made the oath witnessed by the land itself. Breaking such an oath would bring great shame. The cliff was also a place where giants would come to release grief. They would scream out their pain and sorrow. The cliff would echo it back. The sound would be overwhelming, cathartic. Afterward, the giant would feel lighter. The burden of their grief would be eased. Scattered throughout Jotunheim was small shrines. These were simple places. They might be a flat stone with offerings placed on it. They might be a carved tree. They might be a pile of rocks. Each shrine was dedicated to something. Some honored ancestors. Some honored spirits of place. Some honored concepts like courage, or wisdom. Giants would stop at these shrines as they traveled. They would leave small offerings. They would say a prayer or speak a wish. The shrines connected the land. They were markers of the sacred within the everyday. They reminded the giants that magic and meaning existed everywhere, not just in great sacred places. All these sacred places were woven into the life of the giants. They marked the important times. They provided solace and guidance. They connected the giants to their past and to the deep powers of the world. They were treasured and protected, ensuring they would be there for future generations. The seasons turn in Jotunheim. The year in Jotunheim moved through its cycles as it had since the world was made. The seasons came and went. Each brought its own character. Each was necessary. The giants lived in harmony with these cycles. Winter was the longest season. It began early and ended late. The first snows would fall when autumn was barely finished. The snow would continue to fall throughout the winter months. It piled high. Drifts formed that were taller than houses. The land was buried under white. The sun barely rose in winter. The days were short. The light was dim. Twilight seemed to last all day. The nights were long and very dark. Only the stars and the northern lights provided illumination. The cold in winter was intense. Frost covered everything. The rivers and lakes froze solid. The ice was thick enough to support the weight of walking giants. Their footsteps on the ice made cracking sounds that echoed across the frozen landscape. The giants were active in winter. This was their season. They felt energized by the cold. They would go hunting across the snow. Tracks were easy to follow. The animals stood out against the white background. The hunters would trek for miles, their breath forming clouds. Ice fishing was common in winter. The giants would cut holes in the thick ice covering lakes. They would lower lines deep into the cold water. They would wait patiently. The fish beneath the ice were slow, conserving energy in the cold water. But they were fat, having fed all summer. Winter was a time for indoor activities. The long nights were perfect for stories and craft. The giants would gather in their hole. Fires would burn constantly. The warmth and light kept the darkness at bay. Children born in winter were considered lucky. They were thought to be strong, born in the harshest season. They would be able to withstand any difficulty. Their birth was celebrated with great feasts. Winter festivals were joyous occasions. The giants would come together to celebrate surviving another year. They would feast on stored foods. They would drink mead and ale. They would compete in winter sports. One sport involved sliding down snowy slopes on boards. The giant would stand on the board and ride it down the mountain. Speed could be tremendous. The ride was thrilling and dangerous. The fastest slider earned bragging rights until the next festival. Another sport was ice throwing. Giants would carve large blocks of ice from frozen lakes. They would compete to throw the blocks the farthest. The blocks were heavy. Only the strongest could throw them great distances. The competition was fierce but friendly. Wrestling matches happened at winter festivals. The giants would grapple with each other. The goal was to throw the opponent to the ground. The matches would go on until someone yielded or was pinned. Champions would be crowned. They would hold their title until the next festival. As winter progressed, the giants would watch for signs of spring. They would note when the days started to grow longer. They would watch for changes in the animals' behavior. They would wait for the first warm wind. Spring arrived gradually. The transition from winter was slow. The days grew longer bit by bit. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Its rays carried more warmth. The snow began to melt. The melting happened first in the valleys. Patches of bare ground appeared. Water dripped from icicles. Streams began to flow again. The sound of running water was everywhere. The ice on the lakes and rivers broke up. Great sheets of ice would crack and split. They would float downstream. The breaking of the ice was dramatic. It sounded like thunder. The giants would come to watch. It signaled that winter was truly ending. As the snow melted, the land was revealed. The earth was dark and wet. It smelled rich. Seeds that had lain dormant began to sprout. Green shoots pushed up through the soil. Spring was a busy time. The giants had work to do. Fields needed to be prepared for planting. Tools needed to be repaired. Buildings needed maintenance after the long winter. Farmers would work their land. They would plow the field. The giant-sized plows would turn the soil. They would scatter seeds. They would pray to the earth for a good growing season. Spring was also the time when baby animals were born. Calves and kids and lambs appeared in the herds. They were small and wobbly. The giants would watch over them carefully. The newborns represented new life, new hope. Birds returned from the south. Their songs filled the air. The giants welcomed the birds. They were a sign that spring had truly arrived. Nests were built. Eggs were laid. The cycle of life continued. Spring rains came. They were cold and steady. They soaked the earth. They filled the streams until they overflowed. Everything was wet. But the rain was necessary. It nourished the growing plants. On clear spring days, rainbows would appear. They arced across the sky. The giants would pause to admire them. Rainbows were considered good omens. They promised better days ahead. Spring festivals celebrated renewal. The giants would gather. They would welcome the new season. They would plant ritual seed. They would bless the fields and herds. They would ask for prosperity in the coming months. As spring warmed into summer, the transformation was remarkable. The land that had been white and gray became green and colorful. Flowers bloomed everywhere. Meadows were carpets of color. Summer in Jotunheim was brief but intense. The sun barely set. The days were long. It was the time of the midnight sun. Even at midnight, twilight lingered on the horizon. The warmth of summer brought growth. Plants grew rapidly. Trees leafed out. Grass grew tall. The giants worked to harvest this abundance. Hay was cut and dried. Herbs were gathered. Berries were picked. Summer was the time for travel. The paths were clear. The weather was mild. Giants would journey to visit friends and family. They would trade goods. They would share news. The isolation of winter was broken. Young giants used summer to explore. They would go on adventures. They would climb mountains they had never climbed. They would find new valleys. They would test themselves against the wilderness. Summer nights were magical. The twilight would last for hours. The giants would stay outside late. They would walk under the never-dark sky. They would watch the sun circle the horizon without setting. Summer was also the time for building. Construction projects that had been planned during winter would be executed. New halls would be raised. Walls would be built. Additions would be made to existing structures. The giants would work together on large projects. Many hands made the work go quickly. The social aspect was as important as the work itself. Working together strengthened community bonds. Summer festivals were held outdoors. The weather was good enough to gather in the open. Great bonfires would be lit. The giants would dance around the fires. They would leap over the flames for good luck. Summer foods were fresh and plentiful. Fish were caught and eaten immediately. Vegetables were harvested and prepared. Milk from the herds was abundant. Cheese was made and stored for winter. As summer reached its peak, the days started to shorten again. The change was subtle at first, but the giants noticed. They knew that autumn was coming. Autumn arrived with cooler temperatures. The warmth of summer faded. Morning frosts appeared. The giants knew they needed to prepare for winter. Harvest was the main focus of autumn. Everything that had grown during the summer needed to be gathered. Grain was cut and threshed. Root vegetables were dug up. Apples and other fruits were picked. Everything was stored in cool cellars. The work was hard, but satisfying. The giants would work from dawn to dusk. They would bring in the harvest. They would can and preserve. They would prepare for the months when nothing grew. Animals were slaughtered in autumn. The giants did not have enough food to keep all their animals through winter. Some would be slaughtered. The meat would be smoked or salted. It would provide food through the cold months. The slaughtering was done with respect. The giants thanked the animals for their sacrifice. They wasted nothing. Every part of the animal was used. Meat for eating, hide for leather, bones for tools, fat for tallow. Autumn was also the time for hunting. The animals were fat from summer feeding. Their fur was thick. This was the best time to hunt. The giants would organize hunting parties. They would go after large game. The forests in autumn were beautiful. The leaves changed color. They turned gold and red and orange. When the wind blew, leaves would fall like rain. They carpeted the ground. Walking through fallen leaves made a satisfying sound. Autumn rains were different from spring rain. They were colder. They lasted longer. Fog would roll through the valleys. Visibility would drop. The world became soft and mysterious. The giants would prepare their homes for winter. They would check the roofs for leaks. They would seal cracks in walls. They would bring in large supplies of firewood. Everything needed to be ready before the snows came. Autumn festivals celebrated the harvest. The giants would give thanks for what had been gathered. They would feast on the fresh food before it had to be preserved. They would drink the new mead and ale. These festivals had a feeling of completion. The work of the year was done. The cycle was complete. Soon would come rest. The giants could relax knowing they were prepared. As autumn ended, the first snows would fall. They would come early in the morning, light flakes drifting down. The land would start to turn white. The giants would watch the snow fall. They knew winter was beginning again, and so the year would turn. Each season followed the one before. Each brought what was needed. The giants lived within these rhythms. They did not fight against nature. They worked with it. They accepted what came. The seasons shaped the giants' lives. Their activities changed with the seasons. Their moods changed. But through it all, they endured. They had endured since the beginning. They would endure until the end. The great giants of legend. Among the giants of Jotunheim, some stood out. These were the giants of legend. Their deeds were remembered. Their names were spoken with respect. They had shaped history. They had interacted with God. They had done things worth remembering. Ymir was the first, the ancestor of all. His story had already been told, but his memory lived on. Every giant could trace their lineage back to him. He was the foundation of their people. After Ymir came many descendants. Some were forgotten. Others were remembered. The ones who were remembered had done something remarkable or had been involved in important events. Ymir was one who was remembered. He and his wife had survived the flood of Ymir's blood. They were the parents of all giants who came after. Without them, the giant race would have ended. Their survival was a miracle. The giants honored them for their endurance. Thiazi was a giant known for his cunning and his love of flying. He could transform into an eagle. In that form, he would soar over all the realm. He could fly higher than any bird. He could see for vast distances. Thiazi lived in Thrymheim, high in the mountain. His hall was filled with treasures. He had collected gold and silver and gems over his long life. He was wealthy and powerful, but he wanted more. He wanted the gift of youth. The goddess Idun kept apples that granted eternal youth. The gods ate these apples regularly. It was why they did not age. Thiazi wanted these apples. He devised a plan to capture Idun and her apples. Using trickery, Thiazi managed to abduct Idun. He took her to Thrymheim. Without her apples, the gods began to age. They grew old rapidly. Their hair turned gray. Their skin wrinkled. They became weak. The gods were desperate to get Idun back. Loki had been involved in Idun's abduction. The gods threatened him. They said he must rescue Idun or face terrible punishment. Loki went to Thrymheim. He used magic to transform Idun into a nut. Then he transformed himself into a hawk. He grabbed the nut and flew away. Thiazi discovered the escape. He transformed into an eagle and gave chase. He was a powerful flyer, faster than Loki. He gained on the hawk. The chase went all the way to Asgard. The gods saw them coming. They had prepared a trap. They built a fire at the walls of Asgard. As Loki flew over, he dropped low and passed safely. Thiazi followed, but his wings caught fire. He fell, burning, into Asgard. The gods killed him there. Thiasse's daughter was Skadi. When she learned of her father's death, she was filled with grief and rage. She armed herself. She went to Asgard to seek vengeance. She would kill the gods who had killed her father, but the gods spoke with her. They offered compensation. They offered marriage to one of their number. They offered to honor Thiasse by placing his eyes in the sky as stars. Skadi considered these offers. She agreed to marry one of the gods. But she had a condition. She would choose her husband by looking only at their feet. The gods stood behind a screen. Only their feet showed. Skadi looked at the feet. She chose the cleanest, most beautiful pair. She thought they belonged to Balder, the fairest of the gods. But the feet belonged to Njord, god of the sea and ships. Skadi was disappointed but kept her word. She and Njord married. However, they were not compatible. Skadi loved the mountains. Njord loved the sea. They tried living in both places but could not be happy. Eventually, they parted. It was amicable. Neither was angry. They simply could not live together. Skadi returned to the mountains. She became a huntress. She roamed the high places with bow and skeet. She was independent and strong. The giants admired her. Utgard Loki was another famous giant. He was a king in Jotunheim. His fortress was Utgard, the greatest stronghold of the giant. He was known for his magical abilities, especially illusion. Thor once came to Utgard with his companions. They were seeking to test themselves against the giant. Utgard Loki welcomed them. He offered them challenges. He said they could compete against his people in any skill they chose. Thor's companions competed first. Loki said he could eat faster than anyone. A great eating contest was arranged, but Loki lost. His opponent ate everything, even the bones and the wooden plate. Thor's servant Thjalfi said he could outrun anyone. A race was arranged, but Thjalfi lost. His opponent was faster than thought itself. Thor decided to compete. First, he tried to drink from a horn. He was told that a good drinker could empty it in one draught. A great drinker could empty it in two. Thor drank and drank, but the horn barely emptied. He felt humiliated. Next, Thor tried to lift a cat. It seemed a simple task, but Thor could not lift the cat. He managed only to lift one of its paws off the ground. He felt weak and foolish. Finally, Thor agreed to wrestle an old woman. She was Utgard Loki's nurse, ancient and feeble. Thor thought it would be easy, but the old woman threw him down. Thor could not defeat her. He was ashamed. Utgard Loki then revealed the truth. Everything had been an illusion. Loki's eating opponent had been fire itself, which consumes everything. Thjalfi's racing opponent had been thought, which is faster than anything. The drinking horn had been connected to the ocean. Thor drank so much that he lowered the sea level, creating tide. The cat had been the world serpent Jormungandr. Thor lifting even one paw was an amazing feat. The old woman had been old age, which no one can defeat. Thor had actually performed miraculously, but Utgard Loki had made it seem like failure. Thor was angry when he learned the truth. He raised his hammer to strike Utgard Loki, but the giant and his fortress vanished. They were illusions too. Thor had to return home, impressed despite himself by giant cunning. Thrym was a giant who once stole Thor's hammer. Without his hammer, Thor was powerless. The giants could attack with no fear. Thrym sent a message. He would return the hammer only if Freya, the beautiful goddess, agreed to marry him. Freya refused absolutely. She would not marry a giant, especially not Thrym. But the gods needed the hammer back. Loki devised a plan. Thor would disguise himself as Freya. He would wear a bridal dress and veil. He would go to Jotunheim pretending to be the bride. Thor hated this plan, but he had no choice. He put on the dress and veil. Loki came with him, disguised as a bridesmaid. They went to Thrym's hall. Thrym was delighted. He prepared a great wedding feast. The disguised Thor sat at the table. Thrym was surprised by how much his bride ate. She devoured whole oxen. She drank barrels of mead. Loki explained that Freya had been so excited about the wedding that she had not eaten for days. Thrym wanted to kiss his bride. He lifted the veil. He saw Thor's eyes. They were fierce and angry. Thrym jumped back. But Loki explained that Freya had not slept for nights, thinking of her new husband. That was why her eyes looked so intense. Finally, Thrym ordered the hammer brought out. It was a tradition to place Thor's hammer on the bride's lap to bless the marriage. As soon as the hammer was laid in Thor's lap, he grabbed it. He threw off the veil. He stood up. In his rage, Thor swung the hammer. Thrym fell. Thor's hammer smashed through the hall. Giants fell left and right. No one could stand against Thor now that he had Mjolnir again. He and Loki fought their way out. They returned to Asgard with the hammer. Suttung was a giant who came to possess the mead of poetry. This mead was magical. Anyone who drank it would become a great poet or scholar. The mead had been made from the blood of Kvasir, the wisest being ever created. Suttung kept the mead in 3 huge containers. He hid them deep inside a mountain. He set his daughter Gunnlod to guard them. No one could reach the mead without getting past her. Odin wanted the mead. He transformed himself into a snake. He slithered into the mountain through a crack. Once inside, he took on his normal form. He found Gunnlod. Odin charmed Gunnlod. He stayed with her for 3 days. She fell in love with him. She allowed him to take 3 drinks of the mead. But Odin's drinks were enormous. In 3 swallows, he drank all the mead from all 3 containers. Then Odin transformed into an eagle. He flew out of the mountain. Suttung discovered the theft. He transformed into an eagle too. He chased Odin across the sky. The chase was close. Suttung nearly caught Odin. But Odin reached Asgard first. He flew over the walls. He spit the mead into containers the gods had prepared. Some mead spilled in his head. It fell to earth. That is why there are some mediocre poets and scholars, those who got only the spilled drop. Suttung had to turn back. He could not follow Odin into Asgard. He had lost the mead. Gunnlod was heartbroken. She had been used and abandoned. The story of Odin and the mead became famous, told by the poets who had drunk it. Hrungnir was the strongest of all giants. He boasted that he could defeat anyone in combat. He was huge even for a giant. His head and heart were made of stone. He wielded a massive whetstone as a weapon. One day, Hrungnir raced his horse against Odin's 8-legged horse Sleipnir. The race went all the way to Asgard. Hrungnir was invited in. He drank heavily. He began to boast. He said he would kill all the gods except Freya and Sif, whom he would take away. The gods grew angry. They called for Thor. Thor arrived with his hammer ready. He challenged Hrungnir to single combat. Hrungnir accepted. They agreed to meet at a place called Jotunheim. Hrungnir prepared for battle. The other giants were worried. If Hrungnir lost, it would be bad for all giants. They built a clay giant to help Hrungnir. This clay giant was huge. His name was Mokukalfi. The battle began. Thor threw his hammer at Hrungnir. Hrungnir threw his whetstone. The weapons met in midair. The whetstone shattered. Part of it hit Thor in the head, knocking him down. But the hammer continued and struck Hrungnir in the head. The stone head broke. Hrungnir fell dead. Thor's servant Thjolfi attacked the clay giant. It was easy to destroy. It had no courage. It crumbled quickly. Thor was victorious, but he had a piece of whetstone lodged in his head. It would stay there forever, causing him pain sometime. These giants and others like them were part of the legend. Their stories were told and retold. They showed the strength of giants. They showed their cleverness. They showed that giants were worthy opponents of God. The stories kept the memory of these individuals alive. The wisdom of the giants. The giants had lived since the beginning. In that vast time, they had accumulated much wisdom. They had learned about the world. They had learned about life and death. They had learned about the nature of existence itself. This wisdom was not written in books. It was carried in memory. It was passed down through generations. It was embodied in sayings and stories. It was part of the giant culture. One area of wisdom concerned the land. The giants knew the earth intimately. They knew how to read the signs of nature. They could predict weather by watching the sky and feeling the wind. They could find water underground by reading the landscape. They knew which plants were safe and which were dangerous. They understood that the earth was alive. It was not just dead matter. It had its own spirit, its own awareness. They treated it with respect. When they took from the earth, they gave thanks. When they dug into the earth, they asked permission first. The giants knew that everything was connected. The trees were connected to the soil. The soil was connected to the water. The water was connected to the sky. The sky was connected to everything. When one thing changed, everything changed. Understanding these connections was essential. They knew about balance. Too much of anything was harmful. Too much rain would flood the land. Too much sun would dry it out. Too much cold would kill. Too much warmth would cause problems. Balance was necessary for life to flourish. The giants understood cycles. Everything moved in cycles. Day followed night. Summer followed winter. Life followed death. Birth followed death. These cycles were natural and right. Fighting against them was pointless. Instead, one should work with them. They knew that change was constant. Nothing stayed the same forever. Mountains eroded. Rivers changed course. Forests grew and burned and grew again. Even the giants themselves changed over time. Accepting change was part of wisdom. The giants had wisdom about relationships. They knew that family was important. Family provided support and belonging. It gave identity. A giant without family was lost. The bonds of blood were strong and should be honored. They knew that community was essential. No giant could survive alone. They needed others. Working together made everyone stronger. Sharing resources ensured everyone had enough. Community was built on trust and reciprocity. They understood that respect was the foundation of all relationships. Respecting others meant listening to them. It meant considering their need. It meant treating them with dignity. Without respect, relationships broke down. The giants knew about conflict. Conflict was natural. People disagreed. Interests clashed. Personalities did not always mesh. Conflict itself was not bad. What mattered was how it was handled. They believed in direct communication. If there was a problem, it should be discussed openly. Hiding feelings or avoiding confrontation only made things worse. Honest talk could resolve most issues. They knew when to compromise and when to stand firm. Some things were not worth fighting over. Flexibility was good, but some principles were too important to compromise. Knowing the difference required wisdom. The giants had wisdom about work. They valued competent. A person should be good at what they did. Whether it was forging, or farming, or fighting, skill mattered. Developing skill took time and practice. There were no shortcuts. They believed in the dignity of all honest work. No work was shameful if it was done well and served a purpose. A farmer was as valuable as a king. A smith was as important as a sorcerer. All contributed to the community. They knew that work should have meaning. Working just to pass time was empty. Work should produce something useful. It should contribute. It should allow the worker to take pride in what they accomplished. Rest was also important. The giants knew that constant work would exhaust anyone. Rest restored energy. It allowed the mind to process and integrate experiences. It provided time for relationships and leisure. Balance between work and rest was necessary. The giants had wisdom about learning. They believed that learning never stopped. Even the oldest and wisest could still learn new things. The world was vast and complex. No one could know everything. They valued experience as a teacher. Doing something taught more than just hearing about it. Mistakes were opportunities to learn. A person who had never failed had never tried anything difficult. They respected elders as sources of knowledge. The elders had lived long. They had seen much. They remembered things that others did not. Their perspective was valuable. Young giants were taught to listen to elders, but they also knew that the young brought fresh perspective. Young giants saw things in new ways. They questioned assumptions. They tried new approaches. The combination of elder wisdom and youthful innovation was powerful. The giants had wisdom about emotions. They acknowledged that emotions were real and powerful. Denying emotions was foolish. Emotions provided important information. Fear warned of danger. Anger indicated that boundaries had been violated. Sadness meant something valuable had been lost. But emotions should not control a person. Feeling anger was fine. Acting on anger without thought was not. Emotions should be acknowledged and then considered. Wise action came from balancing emotion and reason. They knew that some emotions were difficult. Grief was painful. Fear could be overwhelming. But these emotions were part of life. Running from them did not work. They had to be felt and processed. Time and support from others helped with difficult emotions. Joy was to be celebrated. When good things happened, the giants marked them. They feasted. They gathered. They shared their happiness. Joy was precious and should not be taken for granted. The giants had wisdom about courage. Courage did not mean having no fear. Everyone felt fear sometimes. Courage meant acting despite fear. It meant doing what needed to be done, even when it was frightening. True courage was not just physical. It took courage to admit mistakes. It took courage to be vulnerable. It took courage to change. It took courage to stand up for what was right when others disagreed. They respected those who showed courage, but they did not expect everyone to be brave all the time. Everyone had limits. Knowing one's limits and respecting them was also a form of wisdom. The giants had wisdom about death. They knew that death came to all living things eventually. Even giants with their long lives would die. Death was not to be feared. It was natural. What mattered was how one lived. A life well lived brought honor. A life of courage and kindness and contribution was a life worth celebrating. When death came, it could be met with peace. They believed in an afterlife, though they were not entirely sure what form it took. Some went to hell, the realm of the dead. Others might have different fates. But existence continued in some form. Death was a transition, not an ending. Honoring the dead was important. The giants remembered those who had passed. They told stories about them. They kept their memories alive. In this way, the dead continued to live through the living. The giants had wisdom about fate. They knew that some things were fated to happen. The Norns wove these fates, and they could not be avoided. Struggling against fate was pointless. But they also knew that, within the bounds of fate, choice existed. How one responded to fated events mattered. Attitude and action could change outcomes even if the basic pattern was set. Free will and fate coexisted. They did not let belief in fate make them passive. They still acted. They still tried. They still worked toward goals. Fate would unfold as it would, but they would meet it actively, not passively. The giants had wisdom about the gods. They knew the gods were powerful. They respected that power. But they did not worship the gods as some other beings did. The giants were old too. They had their own power. The relationship with gods was complex. They knew that the gods were not always just. Sometimes the gods acted in their own interests, without regard for others. This had to be accepted. The gods were what they were. Complaining about it changed nothing. But the giants also knew that the gods needed the giants sometimes. The world was large. The gods could not control everything. There was a balance of power. Neither gods nor giants were supreme. The giants had wisdom about magic. They knew that magic was powerful, but not unlimited. Every spell had a cost. Power came from somewhere. It had to be paid for. They knew that magic should be used carefully. Reckless use of magic could backfire. Spells could go wrong. Curses could return to the caster. Respect for magical forces was essential. They believed that magic worked best when it aligned with natural law. Magic that tried to force things against their nature was difficult and dangerous. Magic that worked with nature was easier and safer. The giants had wisdom about time. They knew that time moved differently for them than for shorter-lived beings. What seemed urgent to humans might not seem urgent to giants. This gave them patience. They knew that some problems solved themselves if given time. Rushing to fix everything immediately often made things worse. Sometimes the wise action was to wait and watch. But they also knew that some opportunities were fleeting. When the right moment came, one had to act. Wisdom involved knowing when to wait and when to act. All this wisdom was not formalized into rules or commandment. It was simply the accumulated understanding of ages. The giants shared this wisdom through stories and examples. They taught by demonstrating. The young learned by watching and listening and living among their elders. This wisdom made the giants who they were. It shaped their culture and their choices. It gave them resilience. It allowed them to endure through countless ages. It would guide them toward whatever future lay ahead. The end of all things. The giants knew about Ragnarok. The word meant the fate of the gods, or the twilight of the gods. It was the prophesied end of the world. It would be a great battle. It would destroy much. But it would also lead to renewal. The prophecies about Ragnarok were old. Theus had seen it in visions. The Volva, the wise woman, had spoken of it. The giants knew what was foretold. They knew their role in it. This knowledge shaped how they viewed the world. The signs of Ragnarok were clear. There would be 3 winters in a row, with no summer between them. This was called Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter. The cold would be harsh. Snow would pile deep. Many would die. Bonds of kinship would break as people fought for survival. War would spread across all lands. Brothers would kill brothers. Fathers would kill sons. No one would show mercy. The moral order would collapse. Chaos would reign. Then the bonds that held the great wolf Fenrir would break. This wolf was one of Loki's children. The gods had bound him, fearing his strength. But at Ragnarok, he would break free. He would run loose, jaws gaping. His upper jaw would touch the sky. His lower jaw would scrape the earth. The world serpent Jormungandr would rise from the ocean. It would thrash and create enormous waves. The waters would rise and flood the land. The serpent would spew poison into air and sea. The sky would split. From Muspelheim would come the fire giants, led by Surtur. He would carry a flaming sword brighter than the sun. Everything he passed would burn. The rainbow bridge Bifrost would break under the weight of the fire giants as they crossed it. From Jotunheim would march the frost giant. Thrym would blow his horn, rallying them. They would sail toward Asgard in a great ship called Naglfar, made from the fingernails of the dead. Loki would be at the helm, having broken free from his punishment. The watchman Heimdall would blow his horn, warning the gods. The gods would arm themselves. They would ride out from Asgard to meet their enemies. The great battle would begin on the plain called Vigrid. Odin would fight Fenrir. The wolf would be mighty. He would devour Odin. But Vidar, Odin's son, would avenge his father. He would step on the wolf's lower jaw and tear the upper jaw. He would kill Fenrir. Thor would fight Jormungandr. The god and the serpent were ancient enemies. They had met before. Now, they would face each other for the last time. Thor would kill the serpent with his hammer, but the serpent's dying breath would poison Thor. Thor would stagger 9 steps and then fall dead. Freyr would fight Surtur, but Freyr had given away his sword long ago. He would fight with an antler. He would be brave, but he would fall to Surtur's flaming blade. Heimdall and Loki would fight each other. They too were old enemies. They would match each other blow for blow. Finally, they would kill each other simultaneously. Tyr would fight Garm, the hound of hell. They would slay each other. The battle would rage. Gods would fall. Giants would fall. Warriors from Valhalla would fall. The plain would be soaked with blood. Fire would spread. The world tree Yggdrasil would shake. Everything would be in chaos. Finally, Surtur would fling fire across the world. Everything would burn. The earth would sink into the sea. The stars would fall from the sky. Steam and smoke would rise. All that existed would be destroyed, but that would not be the end. After the destruction, there would be renewal. The earth would rise again from the sea. It would be green and fresh. Plants would grow without being planted. Fields would produce crops without being sown. A new sun would arise. It would be the daughter of the old sun who had been devoured by the wolf skull. The new sun would shine brightly, lighting the new earth. Some gods would survive. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, would live. Modi and Magni, sons of Thor, would carry their father's hammer. Balder and Hod would return from hell. These survivors would gather. They would sit where Asgard once stood. They would remember the old times. 2 humans would also survive. They would be called Life and Lifthrasir, life and lover of life. They had hidden in a place called Hodmimir's forest. The fire had not reached them. They would emerge onto the new earth. They would repopulate the human world. A new age would begin. It would be better than the old age. There would be peace. There would be plenty. The survivors would build anew, wiser for what had been lost. The giants knew this prophecy. They knew they would march in Ragnarok. Many would die. Their realm might be destroyed. But they also knew it was fated. There was no avoiding it. The prophecy would come true. Some giants looked forward to Ragnarok. They harbored old grievances against the gods. They remembered Ymir. They remembered the times gods had killed giants, or tricked them, or humiliated them. Ragnarok would be their chance for vengeance. Other giants viewed it with resignation. They did not want destruction. But if it was fated, it would happen. They would play their role because they must. They accepted the twilight that was coming. A few giants hoped that after Ragnarok, things might be different. Perhaps in the new world, giants and gods could coexist peacefully. Perhaps the old enmities would be forgotten. Perhaps a better world would emerge from the ashes. But for now, Ragnarok lay in the future. The signs had not yet appeared. Fimbulwinter had not come. The wolves still chased the sun and moon, but had not caught them. The bonds on Fenrir still held. The world serpent still lay in the ocean. The fire giants remained in Muspelheim. Life continued. The giants went about their days. They lived their lives. They worked and loved and built and created. They told their stories and practiced their magic. They raised their children and honored their dead. They knew the end would come. But it was not here yet. There was still time. Time to live. Time to experience. Time to be. And so they lived fully, making the most of the time they had. The future was unknown beyond Ragnarok. The prophecy spoke of what would happen during the twilight of the gods, and immediately after. But what came later? How would the new age develop? What role would any surviving giants play? These questions had no answers. The future was a mystery. It would unfold as it would. The giants could not control it. They could only face it with courage and wisdom when it arrived. For now, there was the present. There was Jotunheim with its mountains and valleys. There were the seasons turning in their eternal cycle. There were the sacred places and the daily routine. There were relationships and work and magic and all the things that made life worth living. The giants cherished these things. They knew nothing lasted forever. The world itself would not last forever. But while it existed, it was beautiful. It was worth experiencing. It was worth loving. And so, the giants continued. They endured as they had always endured. They lived in their ancient realm. They carried their ancient wisdom. They maintained their connections to the primal forces of creation. They were part of the world, woven into its very fabric. The old stories would continue to be told. The children would continue to listen. The knowledge would be passed down. The traditions would be maintained. Until the time came for endings, the giants would remain. They would be what they had always been. The old ones, the first people, the children of ice and fire, the descendants of Ymir. And in the long nights of Jotunheim, by the light of fires, and under the glow of northern lights, their voices would continue to echo through the ages. Their stories would continue to be told. Their presence would continue to be felt in the bones of the mountains and the depths of the glaciers. The giants were eternal, even knowing that eternity itself would one day end. This was was their nature. This was their legacy. This was who they were, and who they would always be, until the very last moment when the world fell into flame and sea, and then rose again, renewed. And perhaps, in that new world that would come after all endings, something of the giants would remain. A memory, and an echo, a presence in the stones and the ice. For things that are truly ancient never completely disappear. They transform, they continue in new forms. The cycle goes on. This was the comfort of the giants. This was their hope. Not that they would avoid the ending, but that something would continue. That their long existence would have meaning. That their stories would somehow persist into whatever came next. And so they lived, day by day, season by season, age by age. The ancient giants in their ancient realm, keeping their ancient ways, waiting for whatever the future would bring, accepting what would come with the patience and strength that had carried them through all the ages since the very beginning of time. The deep holes and hidden valleys. In the heart of Jotunheim, far from the borders and the sea, lay regions that few outsiders ever saw. These were the inner lands, the places where the oldest giant families made their homes. The landscape here was dramatic and beautiful in ways that took the breath away. One such place was the Valley of Echoes. This valley was narrow and deep. Cliffs rose on either side, smooth and vertical. The cliffs were so tall that from the valley floor, the sky seemed like a distant ribbon. The stone of the cliffs was dark gray, almost black. Water seeped from cracks in the rock, creating thin waterfalls that fell for hundreds of feet before splashing into pools below. The Valley of Echoes got its name from the sounds that filled it. Every noise echoed and re-echoed. A single footstep would reverberate for several seconds. A voice would be repeated dozens of times, each echo slightly softer than the last. The giants who lived in the valley had learned to speak softly. Otherwise, the echoes would become overwhelming. The valley had a peculiar effect on music. When instruments were played, the echoes would harmonize with the original notes. A single flute would sound like many flutes playing together. The giants of the valley were known for their musical abilities. They composed pieces specifically designed to work with the echo. The resulting music was haunting and complex. At the head of the valley was a great hole carved into the cliff face. This hole belonged to the family of Hrafn, whose name meant raven. Hrafn was ancient even by giant standards. He had lived for more than 3,000 years. His beard was long and white. His eyes were gray like the stone around him. He moved slowly, but with dignity. Hrafn's hall was enormous. The entrance was a carved archway 30 feet high. Beyond the entrance was a corridor that went deep into the mountain. The corridor was wide enough for 3 giants to walk side by side. Lamps hung at intervals, providing light. The lamps burned oil made from fish. The oil was scented with herbs, giving off a pleasant smell. The corridor opened into the main hall. This space was vast. The ceiling was supported by columns that had been left standing when the rest of the rock was carved away. Each column was carved with scenes from giant history. One showed Ymir, in the void. Another showed the flood. Another showed the building of the first giant settlements. The carvings were intricate and beautiful. The floor of the hall was smooth stone, polished over centuries of use. Rugs covered parts of the floor. These rugs had been woven by Hrafn's wife and daughters over many years. They showed patterns of animals and plants, and geometric designs. The colors were rich, made from natural dyes. At one end of the hall was a raised platform. Here sat Hrafn's high seat. The seat was carved from a single piece of stone. It was decorated with silver inlay, showing ravens in flight. Behind the seat hung a tapestry showing the world tree Yggdrasil. The tapestry was old and precious. Smaller rooms opened off the main hall. There were sleeping chambers for family members. There were storage rooms filled with food and supplies. There was a room for weaving. There was a room where weapons and armor were kept. There was a room dedicated to magical work, where runes were carved and spells were prepared. Deep within the mountain was a natural cavern that Hrafn had discovered when first carving his hall. This cavern had a pool of clear water fed by an underground spring. The water was cold and pure. Hrafn used this as his private bathing place. The cavern walls glowed faintly with phosphorescent minerals. The glow was gentle, like starlight. Ralphn's family had lived in the Valley of Echoes for generations. They knew every path and every stone. They knew where the best herbs grew. They knew where fish gathered in the stream that ran through the valley. They knew the weather patterns and could predict storms days in advance. The family held gatherings several times a year. Relatives would come from distant parts of Jotunheim. The hall would fill with giants. Food would be prepared in huge quantities. The feasting would last for days. Stories would be told. The history of the family would be recounted. Young people would learn who their ancestors were and what deeds they had performed. During these gatherings, disputes within the family would be settled. If two relatives had quarreled, they would present their cases to Hrafn. He would listen carefully to both sides. He would consider what he heard. Then he would render judgment. His word was final. His wisdom was respected. Disputes ended when he decided them. Not far from the Valley of Echoes was the Silverwood. This forest was unique in all of Jotunheim. The trees there had bark that shimmered like silver. In moonlight or starlight, the entire forest would glow softly. Walking through the Silverwood at night was like walking through a dream. No one knew why the trees had silver bark. Some said it was magic from the old times. Others said minerals in the soil caused it. Whatever the reason, the trees were beautiful and strange. The wood from these trees was valuable. It could be carved easily, but was strong once shaped. It never rotted. Objects made from silverwood would last forever. The giants were careful about harvesting from the silver wood. They took only what they needed. They thanked the trees before cutting them. They planted new saplings to replace what they took. The forest was sacred to them. They wanted it to remain for future generations. In the center of the silver wood was a clearing. In the clearing stood a single enormous tree. This tree was different from the others. Its trunk was wider than any other tree in the forest. Its branches spread out to cover the entire clearing. Its leaves were larger and darker. This tree was called the Heart Tree. The Heart Tree was very old. It had been standing since before the giants came to this part of Jotunheim. It had witnessed countless seasons. Its roots went deep into the earth, tapping into the life force of the land itself. The tree was aware. It could not move or speak, but it knew what happened around it. Giants would come to the Heart Tree to meditate. They would sit beneath its branches. They would still their minds. The tree's presence was calming. It radiated a sense of peace and stability. Those who meditated under the Heart Tree often received insight. Their questions would be answered. Their troubles would seem less overwhelming. Once a year, at midsummer, the giants would gather at the Heart Tree for a ceremony. They would bring offerings of water and song. They would honor the tree for its guardianship of the forest. They would ask for its blessing on the land. The ceremony was simple but deeply felt. It connected the giants to the natural world and to the cycles of growth and life. Beyond the silver wood, the land rose into high mountains. These were called the Titan Peaks. They were the tallest mountains in Jotunheim. Their summits were always covered in snow and ice. Clouds hid the peaks most of the time. Only on the clearest days could the summits be seen. Few giants lived in the Titan Peaks. The climate was too harsh even for them. The cold was extreme. The wind was constant and fierce. Avalanches were common. But some giants were drawn to these heights. They were the ones who sought solitude and challenge. High on one of the Titan Peaks lived a giant named Skaldi, not to be confused with the famous Skadi. This Skaldi was male, a hermit who had withdrawn from giant society. He had built himself a small dwelling from piled stones. The dwelling had only one room with a low ceiling. It provided basic shelter from the element. Skaldi had lived alone for over 500 years. He spent his days in contemplation. He watched the play of light on ice. He listened to the wind. He observed the rare animals that lived at such heights. He had stripped his life down to essentials. He ate little. He slept little. He existed in a state between living and meditating. Other giants would sometimes make the difficult climb to visit Skaldi. They would ask him questions about life and meaning. Skaldi would answer in few words. His answers were often cryptic, but those who listened carefully found wisdom in his words. He saw things from a perspective that others did not have. His isolation had given him clarity. Thaldi told visitors that the mountains taught important lessons. They taught about perseverance. The mountains endured all weather, all seasons. They stood firm against wind and ice, and time itself. They taught about perspective. From the peaks, the problems of the valleys seemed small. They taught about silence. In the silence of the heights, one could hear one's own thoughts clearly. On the eastern side of the Titan peaks was a phenomenon known as the Singing Glacier. This glacier was massive. It flowed slowly down the mountain, moving inches per year. The ice was deep blue, compressed by its own weight over millennia. Crevasses split the surface of the glacier. These crevasses were deep and dangerous. The glacier got its name from the sounds it made. As the ice moved and cracked and settled, it produced noises. These noises sounded like singing. Sometimes it was a low hum. Sometimes it was a high whistle. Sometimes it was a series of notes that almost sounded like a melody. The singing was constant, though it varied in tone and volume. Scientists among the giants had studied the singing glacier. They tried to understand what caused the sound. They concluded that the ice's movement created vibration. The vibrations resonated through the glacier. The shape and density of the ice affected how the vibrations sounded. But even understanding the mechanism, the singing remained beautiful and mysterious. The giants had stories about the singing glacier. One story said that the glacier was alive. It sang because it was happy or sad, or simply expressing itself. Another story said that spirits lived in the glacier. The singing was their voices. Another story said the glacier remembered songs from the beginning of time and sang them still. Whatever the truth, the glacier was a place of power. Magic worked differently near it. Spells of ice and cold were amplified. Those with the gift of prophecy found their visions clearer when they stood on the glacier. The glacier was included in pilgrimages that young giants made as part of their coming-of-age rituals. South of the Titan peaks was a region called the Bone Plains. This was a flat expanse that stretched for hundreds of miles. The soil was thin. Grass grew in sparse tufts. Rocks littered the surface. The rocks were white and gray, bleached by sun and wind. From a distance, the landscape looked like bones scattered across the ground. Hence the name. The Bone Plains were windy. There was nothing to block the wind. It blew constantly from the north. It was a cold wind, carrying the chill of the ice fields beyond. The wind made a whistling sound as it moved across the plains. The sound was mournful, like the crying of lost souls. Few lived on the Bone Plains. There was little shelter. Water was scarce, but herders would bring their animals there during certain seasons. The grass, though sparse, was nutritious. The animals would graze widely, supervised by the herders who followed them on foot or on horseback. The herders lived in temporary camps. They used tents made from animal hides stretched over wooden frames. The tents were designed to withstand the wind. They were low and streamlined. Inside, they were cozy enough. The herders would huddle together at night, sharing warmth and stories. During the day, the herders would watch their animals. They would scan the horizon for predators. Wolves roamed the Bone Plains. So did bears. The herders carried weapons and were prepared to defend their herd. They also watched the sky. Eagles and other large birds would sometimes attack young animals. The herders developed a culture of their own. They sang songs unique to the plain. The songs were about freedom and wind and wide spaces. They had their own stories, different from those told in the valleys and mountains. They had their own customs and beliefs. Once a year, all the herders would gather for a great meeting. They would drive their animals to a central location. There, they would trade and socialize. Young people from different herding families would meet. Marriages would be arranged. News would be shared. The meeting was a highlight of the year. At the southern edge of the Bone Plains, the land dropped away suddenly. There was a cliff nearly 1,000 feet high. Beyond the cliff was a land of forests and rivers. This was the borderland between the harsh northern regions of Jotunheim and the more temperate southern region. The cliff had a name, the World's Edge. From the top of the cliff, one could see for incredible distances. The view was breathtaking. The forest below looked like a green carpet. Rivers glinted like silver threads. In the far distance, on clear days, one could sometimes see the ocean that separated Jotunheim from Midgard. A path descended the cliff. It was called the 1,000 Steps, though it actually had more steps than that. The steps had been carved into the rock by giants long ago. They were steep and narrow. Descending them required care, but the path allowed travel between the northern and southern regions of Jotunheim. At the base of the cliff was a way station. This was a stone building where travelers could rest. It was maintained by a giant family who had taken on this duty generations ago. The current keeper was a woman named Gro. She was middle-aged by giant standards, having lived about 800 years. Gro welcomed all travelers. She provided food and a place to sleep. She asked no payment, though travelers often left gifts. Gro considered her work a sacred duty. The way station had been there for thousands of years. It would be there for thousands more. She was simply the current keeper in a long line. Gro heard many stories from travelers. She learned news from all parts of Jotunheim. She knew which regions were prospering and which were struggling. She knew of marriages and births and deaths. She knew of disputes and alliances. In her way, she was one of the best informed giants in the realm. Travelers appreciated Gro's hospitality. After the difficult descent, they were tired and hungry. Gro's warm welcome and hot food revived them. Her conversation was pleasant. She had a gift for making people feel at ease. Many travelers counted her as a friend, though they might only see her once every few years. The southern forests of Jotunheim were different from the northern ones. The trees were not as large, but there were more varieties. Oak and ash and birch grew alongside pine and fir. The forest floor was covered with ferns and flowers. Streams were common, providing water and supporting lush vegetation. These southern forests were home to many giants. The climate was milder. Food was more plentiful. Communities were larger here than in the harsh north. The giants built proper villages with multiple families living in proximity. One such village was called Ironwood, sharing a name with the more famous Dark Forest, but being quite different in character. This Ironwood was a pleasant place. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Birds sang cool. Children played safely. It was a good place to raise a family. The village had about 50 families. That meant several hundred giants in total. The village was organized around a central square. The square had a large fire pit in the center. Around the square were the most important buildings: the meeting hall, the temple, the storehouse, and the home of the village elder. The meeting hall was where the community gathered to discuss important matters. Decisions were made by consensus when possible. Everyone had a voice. Debates could be lengthy, but they ensured that all perspectives were heard. The giants valued fairness and inclusion in their governance. The temple was dedicated to the spirits of the land and ancestors. It was a simple building, but well maintained. Giants would come there to pray or meditate. Offerings were left on the altar. The temple was tended by a priestess named Hindla. She led ceremonies and provided spiritual guidance to the community. The storehouse held the community's collective resources. When hunters brought back game, a portion went to the storehouse. When farmers harvested crops, a portion went to the storehouse. The stored food was distributed to those in need. It was also used for feasts and celebrations. The system ensured no one went hungry. The village elder was a man named Alvis. His name meant all-wise, and he lived up to it. He had studied extensively in his youth. He knew history and law. He knew law and custom. He knew magic and healing. He was a resource for the entire village. Alvis was patient and kind. He would listen to anyone's problems. He would offer advice when asked. He would mediate dispute. He would teach those who wanted to learn. He never claimed to know everything. When he did not know something, he would say so honestly. This humility made people trust him more. The village of Ironwood had a school for children. Young giants would gather there to learn. They learned reading and writing. They learned mathematics and astronomy. They learned history and geography. They learned practical skills like farming and crafting. The education was broad and thorough. The teacher was a woman named Saga. She loved learning and loved teaching even more. She made lessons interesting by telling stories and using examples from real life. She encouraged questions. She praised effort and improvement. Under her guidance, the children of Ironwood grew up well-educated and curious. Ironwood had skilled craftspeople. There was a blacksmith who made tools and weapons. There was a potter who made vessels of all sizes. There was a weaver who made cloth. There was a leatherworker who made clothing and shoes. There was a carpenter who built furniture and repaired buildings. Each craftsperson took pride in their work. The blacksmith was named Sindri. He was not related to the famous dwarf Sindri who forged Mjolnir, but he was proud to share the name. Sindri's forge was always hot. The sound of his hammer on anvil rang through the village. He made plows for farmers and axes for woodcutters and knives for everyone. His work was excellent and fairly priced. The village had an inn called the Golden Bear. This was where travelers stayed when passing through. The inn was run by a jovial giant named Bjorn, which appropriately meant bear. Bjorn loved company. He loved hearing stories from travelers. He would serve them his best food and drink. He would ensure they were comfortable. Many travelers went out of their way to stay at Bjorn's inn because the hospitality was so good. Life in Ironwood followed comfortable rhythms. People knew their neighbors. They helped each other. When someone's barn needed repairs, others would come to help. When someone was sick, others would bring food and check on them. When someone had good fortune, others would celebrate with them. The community was close-knit and supportive. Ironwood had festivals throughout the year. There was a spring festival to celebrate planting. There was a midsummer festival to celebrate the longest day. There was a harvest festival to give thanks for the crops. There was a winter festival to mark the longest night. Each festival had its own traditions and activities. The festivals brought the whole community together. Work would stop for several days. Everyone would participate in the celebrations. There would be feasting and music and dancing. There would be games and competitions. There would be religious ceremonies. The festivals strengthened the bonds within the community. Children in Ironwood grew up happy and secure. They played in the forests and streams. They learned from their parents and teachers. They were part of a community that valued them. When they grew older, some would stay in Ironwood. Others would venture out to see the wider world. But they would always remember their village with fondness. The southern regions of Jotunheim also had farmland. The soil was better here than in the north. The growing season was longer. The giants grew various crops. There was grain for making bread. There were vegetables of many kinds. There were fruits. The farms produced enough to feed the population with surplus to spare. Farmers worked hard, but were respected for their labor. They understood the land. They knew when to plant and when to harvest. They knew how to rotate crops to keep the soil healthy. They knew how to manage pests without using harmful methods. Their knowledge came from generations of experience. One particularly successful farm was run by a family called the Earth Friend. The family had farmed the same land for over 1,000 years. The current head of the family was a woman named Jord. Her name meant earth, and she had a special connection to the soil. Jord could sense what the land needed. She could tell where water ran underground. She could tell which fields needed rest. She could tell when rain was coming. Some said she had magical abilities. Jord said she simply listened to the land. Whatever the source of her knowledge, her farm prospered year after year. Jord's farm had fields of grain that stretched for miles. The grain grew tall and healthy. At harvest time, it would be golden and full. Jord employed several other giants to help work the land. She treated them fairly, paying good wages and providing meals. Her workers were loyal and stayed with her for years. The farm had orchards where apple and pear trees grew. The fruit from these trees was famous throughout the region. It was large and sweet and flavorful. Jord would take baskets of fruit to markets in nearby villages. Her fruit sold quickly because everyone knew its quality. Jord had children who were learning to farm. They worked alongside her in the field. They asked questions and listened to her answers. They were absorbing the knowledge she had to share. One day, they would run the farm. They would pass it on to their own children. The cycle would continue. The markets in southern Jotunheim were lively places. Giants would bring goods to trade. Farmers brought produce. Herders brought meat and leather. Craftspeople brought tools and cloth and pottery. Traders from distant regions brought exotic goods. The markets were chances to socialize as well as to conduct business. One of the largest markets was held in a town called Crossroad. The town got its name because several major paths met there. It was centrally located. Giants from all directions could reach it easily. The market at Crossroads happened once a month. It lasted for 3 days. During those days, the town swelled with visitors. The market had sections for different goods. There was a food section where farmers and herders sold their product. There was a crafts section where artisans displayed their work. There was a livestock section where animals were traded. There was even a section for magical items where rune-carved objects and potions could be purchased. Walking through market was an experience for the senses. The smell of fresh bread and roasting meat filled the air. The sound of bargaining and conversation created a constant buzz. The sight of so many giants moving about, so many goods displayed, was overwhelming in a good way. The market was vibrant and alive. Children loved market days. Their parents would give them small amounts of money to spend. The children would wander the stalls, looking at everything. They might buy sweets or small toys. They would watch performers who entertained the crowd. They would run and play with other children. Market days were adventures. The market also had a section where information was exchanged. There was a bulletin board where notices were posted. Someone looking for lost livestock would post a notice. Someone offering services would post a notice. Someone announcing an event would post a notice. The board was checked frequently. Town criers would also share news at the market. They would stand in the central square and call out announcements. They would tell of births and deaths and marriages in the region. They would share news from distant parts of Jotunheim. They would warn of dangers like aggressive predators or unstable paths. People would gather to listen. The markets facilitated not just trade, but also matchmaking. Young giants would see each other at market. Flirtations would begin. Parents would notice suitable potential partners for their children. Introductions would be made. Many marriages in southern Jotunheim started with a meeting at the Crossroads market. The southern reaches of Jotunheim gradually gave way to warmer land. The forests became less dense. The air became milder. Eventually, one reached the borders where Jotunheim met other realms. These borderlands were interesting places where different influences mixed. The rivers and waters. Water was essential to life in Jotunheim. Rivers flowed from the mountains down through the valleys. They carried meltwater and rain. They provided drinking water for giants and animals. They supported plants along their banks. They were highways for travel and trade. The rivers shaped the land and the lives of those who lived near them. The greatest river in Jotunheim was called Slidre. This river was wide and deep. Its current was strong. It flowed from high in the northern mountains all the way to the southern sea. The journey of the river covered hundreds of miles. Along its length, many settlements had been established. Slidre began as a trickle from a glacier. The glacier fed a small stream. The stream joined with other streams. The water gathered volume and force. By the time it reached the lowlands, Slidre was a mighty river. Its waters were cold and clear. Fish swam in its depths. Birds nested along its bank. Giants had built bridges across Slidre at several points. These bridges were engineering marvels. They were made of stone, arching across the water. Each bridge was wide enough for several giants to walk side by side. The bridges could support tremendous weight. They had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. One of these bridges was called the Long Span. It crossed Slidre at a point where the river was especially wide. The bridge was over half a mile long. Building it had taken decades. Hundreds of giants had worked on its construction. The completion of the long span had been celebrated with a festival that lasted a month. River traffic was common on Slidre. Giants used boats to transport goods. The boats were large, carved from whole trees, or built from planks. They had flat bottoms to navigate shallow areas, and deep keels for stability in deep water. Oars powered them. Those sails were used when the wind was favorable. Traveling by boat was faster than walking. A journey that took a week on foot might take only 2 days by boat. But boat travel had its risks. The river's current could be treacherous. There were rapids in some sections. Rocks lurked just below the surface in others. Skilled pilots were needed to navigate safely. River pilots were respected professionals. They knew every bend and current. They knew where it was safe to travel and where it was dangerous. They could read the river, understanding what the patterns on the surface revealed about what lay beneath. Hiring a good pilot could mean the difference between a safe journey and disaster. Along the banks of Slidda were many fishing villages. The giants in these villages made their living from the river. They fished with nets and lines. They caught fish of many varieties. Some fish were small, good for eating immediately. Others were large, enough to feed a family for days. The fish were fresh and delicious. The fishermen had developed techniques passed down through generations. They knew the best spots to fish. They knew what bait to use for different fish. They knew the times of day when fish were most active. They knew how to read weather signs to predict when fishing would be good or poor. One fishing village was called River's Bend. It sat on a curve of the Slidda where the water flowed more slowly. This made it ideal for fishing. The village had about 20 families. They all worked together, sharing the catch and the profits. The community was tight-knit, bound by common work and mutual dependence. The villages of River's Bend had a festival each spring to honor the river. They would gather at the water's edge. They would thank Slidda for providing fish. They would pour mead into the water as an offering. They would ask for a good fishing season. Then they would feast and celebrate, grateful for the river that sustained them. Besides Slidda, there were many smaller rivers throughout Jotunheim. Each had its own character. Some were fast and wild, racing down mountainsides. Others were slow and meandering, winding through meadows. Some were wide and shallow. Others were narrow and deep. Each was important to the regions through which it flowed. Lakes dotted the landscape. Some were small, hidden in mountain valleys. Others were vast, like inland seas. The largest lake in Jotunheim was called Ymir Lake. It was called this because on calm days, its surface was perfectly still. It reflected the sky and surrounding mountains so perfectly that it was hard to tell where the land ended and the reflection began. Ymir Lake was deep. Its bottom had never been found. Legends said it was bottomless, extending down into the roots of the world itself. Others said there were underwater caves connecting it to distant ocean. Whatever the truth, the lake was mysterious and beautiful. A giant named Ran lived on the shores of Ymir Lake. She was old, having lived over 2,000 years. She was a seer, able to perceive things hidden from others. Giants would come from far away to consult her. She would gaze into the still waters of the lake. In the water, she would see visions. These visions would guide her answers. Ran lived in a simple cottage near the shore. She wanted no luxuries. She lived on fish from the lake and vegetables from her small garden. She sought no payment for her prophecies. Those who consulted her would leave offerings if they wished, but Ran never asked for them. Her gift was freely given. Those who came to Ran would find her sitting by the lake. She would invite them to sit beside her. She would listen to their questions without interrupting. Then she would gaze into the water. She would sit in silence for a time. Eventually, she would speak. Her words were carefully chosen. She never said more than necessary, but what she said was usually helpful. Ran had predicted many things over her long life. She had predicted storms and droughts. She had predicted births and death. She had predicted conflicts and alliances. She had predicted good fortune and disaster. Her accuracy was legendary, but she would not predict everything. Some things, she said, were better left unknown. The coasts of Jotunheim were rugged and dramatic. Cliffs rose straight from the sea. Waves crashed against the rocks with tremendous force. The spray would rise high into the air. The sound was constant, a roar that never stopped. The coastal regions were wild and beautiful. Sea giants lived along the coasts. They were comfortable with water in a way that mountain giants were not. They could swim in the cold ocean. They could hold their breath for long periods. They could dive deep to catch fish and gather shellfish. The sea was their element. These sea giants built their homes in sea caves. The caves provided shelter from storms. The entrances were above the high tide line. Inside, the caves were spacious. The sea giants would light fires for warmth and cooking. The smoke would find its way out through cracks in the rock. The sea giants fished the ocean. They used boats, but smaller ones than those used on rivers. Ocean boats needed to handle waves. They were built strong and flexible. They could ride over swells without breaking. The sea giants were excellent sailors. They respected the ocean's power and never took unnecessary risks. Whales swam in the ocean off Jotunheim's coast. These whales were enormous. Even the giants were small compared to them. The sea giants would sometimes hunt whales. It was dangerous work. A whale could destroy a boat with one movement of its tail. But a successful whale hunt would provide food and materials for months. The sea giants did not hunt whales often. They took only what they needed. They honored the whales as they honored all living things. When a whale was taken, every part was used. The meat was eaten. The blubber was rendered for oil. The bones were carved into tools. The skin was tanned. Nothing was wasted. Storms were common along the coast. The ocean would become wild. Waves would grow to incredible heights. Wind would howl. Rain would fall in sheets. The sea giants would retreat to their caves during storms. They would wait out the weather. They had learned patience from the sea itself. After storms, interesting things would wash ashore. Driftwood from distant lands. Shells of rare creatures. Sometimes treasures from sunken ships. The sea giants would walk the beaches after storms. They would gather what the sea had given up. Some items were useful. Others were simply beautiful. All were gifts from the ocean. The sea giants had their own culture. Their songs were different from those of mountain or forest giants. Their songs spoke of waves and wind and endless horizon. Their stories featured sea creatures and ocean voyages. Their way of speaking had its own rhythm, like the rhythm of waves. Children of the sea giants learned to swim almost before they could walk. The ocean was not feared, but respected. Young giants would play in the shallows. They would dive for shells. They would ride small boats. They grew up at home in the water. This comfort with the sea was part of their identity. The sea giants traded with other giants. They brought fish and seaweed and shells to inland market. In return, they received grain and cloth and metal goods. The trade benefited everyone. It connected the coast with the interior. It bound the different regions of Jotunheim together. One sea giant had become famous for his diving ability. His name was Ymir. He could dive deeper and stay under longer than anyone else. He could reach depths where no light penetrated. He would bring up strange creatures from the deep. He would describe places on the ocean floor that no one else had seen. Ymir dove for pleasure as much as for practical reasons. He loved the underwater world. He loved the silence and the pressure and the strange beauty of the deep. When asked why he dove, he would say it was because the depths called to him. He could not resist their call. Ymir had explored underwater caves. Some caves had air pockets where he could surface and rest. Others went on seemingly forever into darkness. He had mapped many of these caves. His knowledge had saved lives when other divers got lost. He would guide them back to safety. The ocean off Jotunheim was not always hostile. On calm days, it was peaceful and beautiful. The water would be blue-green and clear. Dolphins would play in the waves. Seabirds would soar and dive. The sun would sparkle on the surface. These days were precious. The sea giants would go out in their boats. They would enjoy the ocean's gentler mood. At night, sometimes the water would glow. Tiny creatures in the water produced light. When the water was disturbed, they would shine. A boat passing through the water would leave a trail of glowing light. Fish swimming would create glowing streaks. It was magical to see. The sea giants called this the ocean star. The sea giants believed the ocean was alive. Not just full of life, but alive itself. They thought it had awareness and will. They spoke to the ocean. They asked for safe passage. They thanked it for providing food. They apologized when they took from it. This relationship with the ocean was central to their worldview. Where rivers met the sea, there were estuaries. These were places where fresh water mixed with salt water. The estuaries were rich with life. Many fish species came there to spawn. Birds gathered there to feed. Plants grew thick on the bank. The estuaries were valuable ecosystems. Giants recognized the importance of estuaries. They protected them. They did not pollute them or overharvest from them. They understood that estuaries were nurseries for the ocean. Protecting estuaries meant ensuring future abundance. This was wisdom gained over many generations. The bond between giants. Giants were individuals, but they were also deeply connected to each other. Family bonds were strong. But beyond family, there were friendships and alliances and partnerships. These connections formed a web that held giant society together. Friendship among giants was a serious matter. It was not entered into lightly. To call someone a friend meant committing to them. It meant standing by them in difficulty. It meant celebrating their joys and mourning their sorrow. Friendship was a bond that could last for centuries. Two giants who became friends would often exchange gifts. The gifts represented their commitment to each other. They might exchange weapons, or jewelry, or some other valuable item. The items would be kept and treasured. They were reminders of the friendship bond. Friends would visit each other regularly. Distance was not a barrier. A giant might travel for days to visit a friend. The visit would be a celebration. The host would prepare a feast. They would spend time together, talking and sharing. When the visitor left, both would feel renewed by the contact. If a giant faced trouble, their friends would help. If a hall burned down, friends would come to help rebuild. If there was a dispute, friends would offer support and advice. If there was danger, friends would stand together against it. The expectation of mutual aid was fundamental to friendship. Partnerships were also common among giants. Two or more giants might partner for a specific purpose. They might partner to run a business. They might partner to undertake a quest. They might partner to work magic that required multiple practitioners. Partnerships were practical arrangements based on mutual benefit. Successful partnerships required clear communication. The partners needed to agree on goals and methods. They needed to trust each other. They needed to share work and rewards fairly. When these conditions were met, partnerships could accomplish things that individuals could not. One famous partnership was between two giants named Buri and Bestla, though these were not the Buri and Bestla from the ancient times. These two were merchants. They traveled throughout Jotunheim buying and selling goods. They had been partners for over 300 years. Their partnership had made them both wealthy. Buri handled the buying. He had a gift for finding valuable goods at reasonable prices. He could spot quality. He could negotiate effectively. He built relationships with producers and craftspeople. He ensured a steady supply of goods to sell. Bestla handled the selling. She understood what people wanted. She knew how to display goods attractively. She could read customers and adjust her approach accordingly. She was persuasive without being pushy. Under her management, goods sold quickly and at good prices. Together, Buri and Bestla complemented each other perfectly. They respected each other's skills. They consulted with each other on major decisions. They split profits evenly. Their partnership was a model for others. Many young giants aspired to find a partner with whom they could work so well. Romantic relationships among giants followed certain patterns. Courtship could be lengthy. Giants lived long lives. They were in no hurry. A couple might court for decades before deciding to marry. They would get to know each other deeply. They would see each other in various situations. They would be sure they were compatible before making a commitment. When a giant decided to propose, they would make a grand gesture. They might climb a difficult mountain to fetch a rare flower. They might craft a beautiful piece of jewelry. They might compose a song or poem. The gesture demonstrated the depth of their feelings and their commitment. If the proposal was accepted, there would be an engagement period. During this time, the families would meet. Arrangements would be made. The couple would prepare for their life together. They might build a home or add to an existing one. They would gather the things they would need. The wedding ceremony was a major event. The whole community would be invited. The ceremony would take place in a sacred location. A priest or elder would officiate. The couple would exchange vows. They would promise to support and care for each other. They would promise to remain together through all circumstances. After the vows, there would be a feast. The feast would last for days. There would be food and drink in abundance. There would be music and dancing. There would be speeches honoring the couple. There would be gifts from the guests. The celebration marked the joining of two lives. Giant marriages were generally stable. The long courtship meant couples knew what they were getting into. The commitment was taken seriously. Divorce was possible, but rare. When marriages did end, it was done formally. The couple would appear before the community. They would explain their decision. The marriage would be dissolved with recognition that it had not worked. Some giants chose not to marry. This was accepted. There was no stigma attached to remaining single. Some giants preferred independence. Others simply never found the right partner. They lived fulfilling lives, regardless. The community did not judge them. Parenthood was valued in giant culture. Children were seen as the future. They would carry on the family line and the culture. Parents took their responsibilities seriously. They provided for their children. They taught them. They prepared them for adult life. Children were raised not just by their parents, but by the whole community. Other adults would help teach and supervise them. If parents were unable to care for children for some reason, others would step in. The attitude was that all children belonged to the community and deserved care and support. Elders held special positions in giant society. They had lived long and learned much. Their experience and wisdom were valuable. Younger giants would seek their advice. They would listen to their stories. They would honor them for their contributions over their long lives. Elders were cared for when they became frail. Their families would ensure they had what they needed. They would be kept comfortable. They would be included in family activities. They would be treated with dignity and respect. This care was seen as both duty and privilege. When an elder died, the mourning was deep but not despairing. The elder had lived a full life. They had accomplished things. They had loved and been loved. Their memory would be preserved. The community would gather to honor them. Stories would be told about their life. Their name would be added to the family history. The bonds between giants extended beyond individuals to families. Families had reputations. Some families were known for producing great warriors. Others were known for scholars or craftspeople or farmers. The family reputation mattered. Individuals carried it with them. Family gatherings happened regularly. Extended family would come together. The gatherings might be for holidays or for no particular reason. They were chances to maintain bonds. Relatives who lived far apart would reconnect. Children would meet their cousins. The gatherings strengthened family identity. Family histories were carefully maintained. Giants knew their genealogies back many generations. They knew who their ancestors had been and what they had done. This knowledge connected them to the past. It gave them a sense of continuity. They were links in a chain stretching back to Ymir himself. Some families had feuds with other families. These feuds could last for generations. They might have started with an insult or a theft or a betrayal. Once started, feuds were hard to end. Each side remembered the wrongs done by the other. New conflicts would arise, keeping the feud alive. But most families lived in peace with their neighbors. They traded and socialized. They helped each other when needed. They celebrated each other's good fortune. The bonds between families created stability and peace in giant society. The art and music of giants were not just warriors and workers. They were also artists. They created beauty. They made music and art and poetry. These creative expressions were important parts of their culture. They brought joy and meaning to life. Music was everywhere in Jotunheim. Giants sang while they worked. They sang at celebration. They sang to their children. They sang when they were happy and when they were sad. Song was a natural expression of emotion and experience. The music of giants was distinctive. Their voices were deep and powerful. When many giants sang together, the sound was overwhelming. It resonated in the chest. It could be heard from great distances. The harmonies were complex, with multiple voice parts weaving together. Giants played various instruments. They had drums made from stretched hide over wooden frames. The drums came in different sizes, producing different tones. A skilled drummer could create intricate rhythms. Multiple drummers, playing together, created compelling beats. They had flutes carved from wood or bone. The flutes produced clear, sweet notes. A flute melody could be haunting and beautiful. Flutists were often played by shepherds and solitary travelers. The music kept them company in lonely places. They had stringed instruments similar to harps or lyres. The strings were thick, sized for giant fingers. The instruments produced deep, resonant tones. They were used to accompany singers. A skilled harpist could play melodies and harmonies simultaneously. They had horns made from animal horns or carved from wood. The horns produced loud, carrying notes. They were used for signaling across distances. They were also used in ceremonies and celebration. The blast of a horn could raise spirits and call people to attention. Music served many purposes. It entertained, certainly, but it also taught. Many songs contained stories or lessons. Children learned history through song. They learned values and proper behavior through song. Music was a teaching tool as effective as direct instruction. Music also unified. When giants sang together, they were connected. They were part of something larger than themselves. Group singing built community. It created shared experiences and memories. It was a social glue that bound people together. Some giants were professional musicians. They dedicated their lives to music. They composed new songs and perfected their performance. They traveled from community to community, sharing their art. They were welcomed everywhere. People loved hearing their music and would pay generously for performances. One such musician was named Bragi. Like the god of poetry, this giant had a gift for music and words. He composed songs that became widely known. His songs were sung by giants throughout Jotunheim. Some of his songs had been sung for hundreds of years and would be sung for hundreds more. Bragi traveled constantly. He would arrive at a settlement. Word would spread that Bragi was there. That evening, people would gather to hear him perform. He would sing for hours, never repeating a song. His voice was strong and clear. His harp playing was masterful. Listeners would be entranced. After performances, people would talk about the songs for days. They would try to remember the words and melodies. They would teach the songs to others. In this way, Bragi's music spread even when he was not present. His influence extended far beyond where he physically traveled. Visual arts were also important to giants. They carved stone and wood. They painted and drew. They wove and embroidered. They created objects that were both functional and beautiful. The line between craft and art was blurry. A well-made tool could be a work of art. Stone carving was particularly valued. The giants had the strength to work with large stones. They would carve statues and reliefs. The subjects were often historical scenes or important individuals. The carvings preserved memory in permanent form. Stone lasted forever. The carvings would remain long after those who made them were gone. One famous stone carving was called the Wall of Ancestors. This was a cliff face that had been carved with images of important giants from history. The carving stretched for over a mile. It had taken generations to complete. New figures were still being added. The Wall of Ancestors was a pilgrimage site. Giants would come to see the images of those who had come before. Wood carving was more common than stone carving because wood was easier to work. Giants carved furniture and tools and decorative objects. They carved panels for walls and doors. They carved figurines and toys. The carvings ranged from simple to incredibly complex. Some wood carvings were practical. A spoon might be carved with a comfortable handle and attractive design. A chest might be carved with geometric patterns. The carving made functional items more pleasant to use and look at. Other wood carvings were purely decorative. A carver might make a sculpture of an animal or person. They might carve an abstract design. These pieces were displayed in homes and halls. They added beauty to living spaces. They showed the skill of the carver. Painting was done on various surfaces. Giants painted on wood panels. They painted on cloth. They painted directly on walls. The paints were made from natural materials. Minerals provided different colors. Plants provided others. The paints were mixed with oil or water to make them workable. Paintings depicted many subjects. Landscapes were common. An artist would paint the mountains or forests of Jotunheim. They would try to capture the beauty of the land. These paintings decorated halls and reminded giants of the world around them. Portraits were also painted. A giant might commission a portrait of themselves or a family member. The painter would work to capture not just appearance but personality. A good portrait revealed something about the subject's character. These paintings became family heirlooms, passed down through generations. Textiles were an art form. Weavers created cloth with complex patterns. They used different colored threads to create images and design. The weaving was done on large looms. It required planning and skill. A complex piece might take months to complete. Embroidery added decoration to cloth. Using needle and thread, artists would create detailed images. They would embellish clothing and hangings. The embroidery was often very fine, with tiny stitches creating realistic representation. Embroidered items were prized. Tapestries were woven or embroidered wall hangings. They were large and impressive. They often told stories. A tapestry might show a famous battle or a mythological scene. Looking at a tapestry, one could read the story it depicted. Tapestries made halls more beautiful and provided insulation against cold. Poetry was highly valued among giants. Poets composed verses about heroes and adventures. They composed love poems and laments. They composed humorous verses and riddles. Poetry was performed aloud. The sound and rhythm of the words were as important as their meaning. Giants had strict forms for poetry. Certain types of poems had specific structures. The number of syllables per line mattered. The placement of stressed syllables mattered. Alliteration and rhyme were used in particular ways. Learning these forms took time. Mastering them took longer. Guild poets could compose spontaneously. They could be given a topic and immediately compose verses about it. This skill was admired. Poets would sometimes compete, challenging each other to compose on difficult subjects. The competitions were entertaining and showcased poetic ability. Poetry preserved history and culture. Epic poems told of the past. They recounted the deeds of heroes. They explained how things came to be. These poems were memorized and recited. They were taught to children. Through poetry, knowledge was passed down across generations. All these art forms enriched giant life. They provided beauty and meaning. They allowed expression of emotions and ideas. They preserved memory and culture. They brought joy and satisfaction to both creators and audiences. Art was not separate from life, but woven into it, making life fuller and richer.